He threw the papers at her feet like she was nothing. Caleb Voss didn't even look at her when he did it, just tossed the land deed across the kitchen table so it slid off the edge and landed in the dirt near her boots. 20 acres. Every dream she had ever carried. Lying in the dust like trash he didn't want anymore. Sign it, he said. Sell it before somebody smarter buys it out from under you. Eliza Whitmore looked at those papers on the ground for a long moment. Then she looked up at her husband, the man who had promised her a life, and something inside her went very quiet. Not the quiet of giving up, the quiet of a decision being made. She did not pick up the papers. If you've ever had someone stand in front of everything you believed in and laugh, this story is for you. If you've ever been told your dream was worthless, it's by the one person who was supposed to believe in you. Stay with me. Because what Eliza Whitmore did next will change the way you think about what's possible. Before we go any further, if this is your first time here, hit that subscribe button right now and turn on notifications. Because we put out stories like this every week, and you do not want to miss what's coming. Drop a like on this video and leave a comment telling me what city or country you're watching from. I want to see exactly how far Eliza's story travels. Now let's go back to that kitchen. Back to those papers on the floor. Back to the moment a woman decided she was done being underestimated. The morning Caleb threw the deed on the floor. It was already a bad day. It had been a bad week, if she was honest. The well on the north side of the property had gone dry again, and the 2 mares they'd been counting on to foal in the spring had both miscarried within the same month. One of the fence lines had blown down in a windstorm, and the repair cost more than they had sitting in their account at the bank in Miles City. Eliza had been patching things together with wire and stubbornness for longer than she could remember, and she was tired in the kind of way that doesn't go away after a good night's sleep. But the papers on the floor, that was something different. I'm not signing anything, she said. Caleb turned around from the window. He had his hat in his hand, turning it in circles, the way he always did when he wanted to look calm but wasn't. He was a handsome man, still broad across the shoulders, a jaw that looked like it had been cut from the same rock as the Montana hills. But there was something in his eyes that had changed over the years, something that had curdled. Eliza. His voice had that particular patience in it, the kind that isn't patient at all. We've had this conversation. We've had a lot of conversations, she said. This one ends the same as the others. He set his hat on the table. That was new. When Caleb set his hat down, it meant he intended to stay a while, to press the thing through. Harlan Pruitt offered us $1,400. $1,400, Eliza. For land that's only worth $800 on a good day with the wind behind it. You think that offer stays on the table forever? Then it doesn't stay on the table. He made a sound, not quite a laugh, not quite a groan. Something frustrated and dismissive all at once. You know what your problem is? You look at 20 acres of hardpan and you see something that isn't there. You've always done it. You built this whole thing up in your head like it was going to be something, some horse paradise, some world-class operation. And meanwhile, the rest of us have been watching you throw good effort after bad dirt for 3 years. 4 years, she said quietly. What? 4 years. We've been here 4 years. He picked his hat back up. And what do we have to show for it? It wasn't a question. Eliza knew that. She also knew that if she started answering it, like it was one started listing the things she had built, the small gains, the mare they'd gentled last fall that nobody thought could be gentled, he would nod and wait, and then say something that made all of it sound like nothing. He was good at that. He had a gift for making things small. Go talk to Pruitt if you want, she said. Tell him it's not for sale. Caleb looked at her for a long time. I'm leaving, Eliza. The words sat in the kitchen between them. Outside, a horse, one of their remaining mares, a gray named Sadie, knocked against the fence post. The sound was small and ordinary and entirely out of place. You're leaving, she repeated. I've got an opportunity in Billings. Work that pays. Work that doesn't depend on the weather and whether some half-broken animal decides to cooperate. He looked at the floor, then back at her. I need you to sign those papers so we can settle this cleanly. And if I don't? He was quiet for a moment. Then you're on your own with it. All 20 acres of it. And when you can't make the tax payments in the fall, you'll lose it anyway, and you'll have nothing to show for it except pride. She thought about being angry. She'd spent so much time being angry in the last year at the land, at the weather, at the neighbors who watched from a distance, with that particular frontier smugness, waiting for the Whitmore woman to fail. She was tired of anger, It took too much out of her and gave nothing back. Then I'll have pride, she said. Caleb picked up his hat, settled it on his head. He picked up the papers from the floor. She hadn't moved to get them, and he seemed annoyed by that, and folded them in half, and put them in his jacket pocket. He walked to the door. He paused with his hand on the frame. You're making a mistake. You've said that before. And I was right before he left. She heard his boots on the porch steps, heard his horse, the big chestnut he'd brought with him when they married, moving away from the post where it was tied. She stood at the kitchen table and listened to the sound of hoofbeats going down the road and getting quieter, and she didn't move until she couldn't hear them anymore. Then she sat down, put her elbows on the table, pressed both hands over her face. She stayed like that for a while. Eliza Whitmore had not grown up expecting easy things. Her father, James Whitmore, had been a man with good intentions and a genuine inability to hold money. He'd moved the family from one edge of Montana to another through her childhood, always following some opportunity that turned out to be thinner than it looked. They'd worked cattle ranches, a sheep operation for one difficult winter, a homestead claim near the Yellowstone that flooded the second spring. By the time Eliza was 16, she knew how to do more things than most grown men, and she knew that none of them were enough by themselves. You had to know all of them at once, and you had to be willing to do whatever the season demanded. What she had also learned, the harder lesson, the one she carried like a stone in her boot, was that the frontier was not kind to women who wanted to run things. It would use your work. It would take your labor and your knowledge and your years, and then it would hand the credit to a man standing nearby. She had watched it happen to her mother a dozen times over. She had promised herself, young and certain the way young people are, that it would not happen to her. Caleb Voss had seemed like the right choice when she was 22. He was ambitious in those days. He talked about land and horses the same way she did with hunger, with plans. She had believed the plans were shared. By the time she understood they weren't. They were already 3 years into the Montana property, and she had more invested in the land than she'd ever had in the marriage. That was a thing she didn't like admitting. She turned it over in her mind sometimes, late at night, and tried to figure out when exactly that had shifted. She couldn't find the moment. It had moved the way seasons move gradually, and then completely, and suddenly the landscape looked nothing like it had before. The day after Caleb left, she went out to the land. Not to work. She had a list of things that needed doing, always did, but she walked the property the way her father had taught her to walk land. Slowly, paying attention, looking at what was actually there instead of what you wished was there, or what you feared was there. 20 acres of hardpan, Caleb had said. It wasn't entirely wrong. The eastern section was rough, rocky, and dry and slow to produce. The well situation was genuinely difficult. 2 of the fence lines needed serious repair before winter, not just patching. She had 6 horses left from the original 8 she'd started with, and of those 6, 2 were in the kind of shape that would make a serious buyer walk away. But the western section, where the land tilted gently and collected what little moisture the sky offered, that was something else. She'd known it from the first week. The grasses that came in there were the right kind. The ground was soft enough in the right places. There was a natural windbreak from a low ridge that protected that section through the worst of the winter storms. Nobody else had seen it. Caleb had looked at the whole property as a single thing and called it worthless. The neighbors who had come by in those first months, most of them once, out of curiosity, with that frontier assessment gaze that told you they were filing you under too ambitious for your own good. They had looked at the rocks in the dry eastern section and reached their conclusions. She had spent 4 years learning the land's patience. She stopped near the fence line of the western section and looked out at the horses. Sadie the gray was watching her. Sadie was always watching her. She was a horse of unusual attention. She tracked people the way most horses tracked weather, with a kind of ongoing calculation. Well, Eliza said, it's just us. Sadie's ears moved. I know, Eliza said. I know. 3 weeks after Caleb left, Harlan Pruitt came by himself. She had expected him eventually. Pruitt ran the largest cattle operation in the county, 1,100 acres, 12 hands, a new house that he had built deliberately visible from the road so that anyone driving past could note its size. He was not a dishonest man, exactly, but he was the kind of man who believed that acquiring things was a sign of having been right about things. He had been trying to add the Whitmore acres to his operation for 2 years. He rode up while she was repairing the north fence. She kept working while he dismounted, because she'd found over the years that continuing to work while a man approached was one of the more efficient ways to communicate that she was not waiting for him. Mrs. Voss, he said. Whitmore, she said. She had gone back to her name the day after Caleb left. It wasn't a dramatic decision, just a practical one. Caleb's name had never fit right anyway. Pruitt cleared his throat. I heard about the situation. News travels. Always does. He rocked back on his heels. He was a big man, broad and deliberate, and he had a way of physically settling into a space that communicated ownership. She had noticed it before. I want you to know that my offer stands. 1,400. Cash. It's more than fair. She drove a fence post staple in with 3 strikes instead of 4, which meant she was annoyed but focused. I know your offer. The answer's the same. Be reasonable, he said, and it was the word reasonable that did it. She had been hearing that word her entire life applied to situations where what was actually meant was easier for me. She put down her tools and turned to look at him directly. Mr. Pruitt, I appreciate you riding out. The answer is no. It was no last month and it's no today. I'm not selling this land. He looked at her for a moment with the expression of a man calculating odds. The taxes come due in October. I'm aware of when the taxes are due. And you've got 6 horses left, by my count. 2 of them not worth much. She held his gaze. You've been counting my horses. He didn't apologize for it. I keep track of what goes on in the county. Good business. He picked up his reins. You seem like an intelligent woman, Miss Whitmore. Intelligent people know when they've reached the limits of a situation. And sometimes, she said, they know when someone else has underestimated it. He made a sound not quite Caleb's sound, but close and mounted up and rode off. She watched him go. Then she picked up her tools and finished the fence. It was Nora Calland who noticed the Beaumont horses first. Nora ran the feed store in Denton with her husband Carl, and she was one of perhaps 4 people in the county who treated Eliza like a person rather than a spectacle. She had come by with supplies in early April and stopped in the yard looking east toward Pruitt's far pastures. You see what he brought in? Nora said. 3 new stock horses, Eliza said. Quarter horses looked like. Good lines, not those. Nora shook her head. The ones from the Beaumont land. After old Beaumont died and the estate sold out, Pruitt bought the horses with the land. 12 of them. The hands are talking about it in town. She paused. Nobody wants to work with them. Eliza looked over at the eastern fence line, then back at Nora. What kind? Wild caught. Most of them. Beaumont was picking them up from the rangeland drives for years, keeping them in poor conditions. They're difficult is the polite word. Nora set down a bag of feed. 2 of them have already hurt a man. Pruitt is talking about having them destroyed. Something in Eliza went still. She had been thinking since Caleb left about what the ranch could be. Not what it was, she was clear-eyed about what it was, which was underfunded and understaffed and built on land that only she seemed to understand. But what it could be. What she could make it into if she had the right animals and the right approach. She had been developing her training methods in small ways for 3 years. Little things adjustments to how she introduced horses to new spaces, how she handled the transition between wild temperament and working partnership. She had theories she hadn't had the horses to test. What's he asking for them, she said. Nora stared at her. Eliza. I know what you're going to say. I'm going to say those horses have injured people. I'm going to say you're one woman with 6 horses and limited feed and a fence that needs replacing. I know all of that. She was already looking east, where Pruitt's pastures ran along the ridge. What's he asking for them? Nora sighed. It was the sigh of a friend who recognized that a decision had already been made. I don't know, but Carl might. That evening, Eliza sat at the kitchen table, the same table where the papers had landed on the floor, and she wrote down everything she knew. About the western pasture. About the horses she had, and what she had learned from them. About the Beaumont animals, what she'd heard about their condition. What she understood about animals that had been kept badly, and what it took to bring them back. She wrote for 2 hours. When she was done, she had something that looked like a plan. It was a frightening plan. It was the kind of plan that would work or would break her completely with very little middle ground. She read it through twice. She made some changes. She read it again. Then she folded it and put it in the small tin box where she kept the deed to the 20 acres, which was there in her name, signed before the marriage and never transferred, and she went to bed. She did not sleep easily, but she slept. Eliza made the offer on the Beaumont horses on a Thursday morning in late April. She rode to Pruitt's operation early, before his hands were fully at work, which meant she had to wait in the yard while someone went to get him. One of the younger hands leaned against the barn and watched her with the particular expression of a young man who has been told something is ridiculous and wants you to know he agrees. She ignored him. Pruitt came out in his work clothes, coffee in hand, looking less composed than he had on his visit to her property. "Miss Whitmore, this is early. I've been up for 3 hours," she said. "I'll be brief. The Beaumont horses. I want to make an offer." He stopped, looked at her. "Those animals are a liability. To you, possibly. I want 6 of them." 6. He repeated it like he was checking that he'd heard correctly. "The Beaumont horses are barely manageable in a group. You want 6 of them by yourself. I have help." This was partially true. She had Nora's boy, Thomas, who came by twice a week and worked hard when he was there. "And I have methods I believe will work." Pruitt drank his coffee. She could see him running the calculation the animals were a problem for him, destructive and expensive to maintain, and he'd already been talking about having them put down. Getting any value from them at all would be better than that outcome. $50, he said. For 6. And you take them in whatever condition they're in. $50 was most of what she had liquid. She knew that. Probably knew something close to it. 40, she said. And you let me choose which 6. He studied her face for a moment. She kept her face the way you keep a fence line maintained and giving nothing away. "Done," he said. She chose carefully. She spent 40 minutes in Pruitt's far pasture, watching the 12 Beaumont horses before she picked a single one. His hands watched from the fence. The young man who had been leaning against the barn was now leaning against this fence instead, and his expression had shifted not to respect, but to something adjacent to it, uncertainty. She chose 4 mares and 2 stallions. Not the wildest. The wildest would be too much too fast, and she was being honest with herself about what she could handle. But not the tamest either. She chose the ones that watched her back. That, she had found, was where it started. The first week with the Beaumont horses was the hardest week of her life on that land, and there had been several candidates for that title. The mares settled faster than the stallions. 2 of them, she named them Clara and Rue, were aggressive in the first days, but showed something underneath it, something that was paying attention. The stallions were a different problem. The darker one, a bay she called Decker, put a bruise on her shoulder, the size of a dinner plate on day 3, when she moved too quickly in a way he found threatening. She sat outside his fence that evening, not inside, just outside, and stayed there until after dark. Not doing anything, just being present. Her shoulder ached badly enough that she'd had trouble with her arm all day. She had made notes on all of it. She was building something. She was not certain exactly what shape it would take, but she was building it. And the land was underneath her, and the deed was in the tin box, and nobody was making that decision but her. Somewhere across the county, Harlan Pruitt was almost certainly calculating timelines for her failure. Somewhere further, Caleb Voss was doing whatever Caleb Voss did now, in Billings, in his new opportunity. She stayed outside Decker's fence until the stars were out. Then she went inside, made herself something to eat, and went over her notes until her eyes wouldn't stay open anymore. By June, something was beginning to happen. She couldn't have pointed to a single day and said, "This is when it changed." But by June, Decker had stopped moving away from her when she entered his space. Clara had started meeting her at the fence line in the mornings. Rue had done something remarkable. She had begun, tentatively, to respond to Eliza's voice as a direction rather than a threat. Thomas, Nora's boy, watched all of it with the intense focus of a 17-year-old who has found something that interests him genuinely. He asked questions she had to think about to answer, which she appreciated. "How'd you know that would work?" he asked one morning, after watching her work with Clara for almost an hour. "Moving like that, not pushing." "I didn't know," she said honestly. "I thought it would work. There's a difference. What if it hadn't? Then I'd have figured out something else." She brushed dust off her hands. "You try the next thing. You keep trying until something works or until you run out of tries." He thought about that. "Which runs out first?" "That's the question," she said. "Isn't it?" He didn't have an answer, neither did she, not with certainty. But it was July now, and she still had the land. And Pruitt's deadline, he hadn't stated it explicitly, but but she knew it was in his mind the way you know a storm is coming. Before you can see, it had not arrived yet. The summer was long and dry and difficult. She kept working. The summer dried out faster than anyone had predicted. By mid-July, the creek that ran along the northern edge of Eliza's property had dropped to a slow trickle that would be nothing by August. She had known this was coming. The signs had been there in May, in the color of the sky, and the way the grasses came in, thin and pale, but knowing a thing and living through it were different experiences. She hauled water twice a day now, morning and evening, working the hand pump at the main well until her right arm had developed a kind of permanent low ache that she had stopped noticing because noticing it didn't change anything. The Beaumont horses were eating through her feed supply faster than she'd calculated. She had done the math 3 times, hoping she'd made an error she could find and fix. She hadn't. At the current rate, she would run short before October. She could reduce feed, but reducing feed on animals she was trying to build trust. With animals that were already operating from a place of accumulated damage and suspicion was exactly the wrong direction. They needed consistency. They needed to learn that this place was different from the places they'd been before. You could not teach that lesson while also taking things away. She was sitting with this problem at the kitchen table on a Wednesday morning when Thomas arrived earlier than usual, which was the first sign that something had happened. Thomas was a reliable boy in his timing Nora had raised him to be, and Eliza had noticed it. He came Tuesdays and Thursdays, reliably at 7, reliably ready to work. Wednesday meant news. She heard him in the yard, heard him slow his horse in the particular way that meant he was uncertain about something, and she was already at the door when he got down. "What happened?" she said. It wasn't a question. He pulled his hat off. He was a tall boy, not yet grown into his height, with his mother's direct eyes and a mouth that always seemed to be working through something before he said it. "There's talk in town. There's always talk in town. About you. About the land." He turned his hat in his hands. She had noticed that men of all ages did this when delivering uncomfortable information, as though the hat were something to negotiate with. Mr. Pruitt was at the feed store yesterday evening. He was talking to Carl about water rights. "The creek that runs through your north section." Eliza went very still. "That creek has been on this property since before Pruitt was born. He's saying there's an old agreement. From before the homestead claim. Says his family had prior water access going back to the original survey." Thomas looked at her steadily. He was trying to gauge how bad this was. She could see it. Carl didn't know if it was true. He said he'd never heard of it. She turned and went back inside. Thomas followed, hat still in hand, and stood near the door in the way he always did when he wasn't sure whether he was being invited into a conversation or just delivering information and leaving. "Sit down," she said. She put the kettle on because she needed something to do with her hands for 60 seconds while she thought. "Did Pruitt say anything else?" "Said the county recorder would have the old survey documents. Said he was going to have his lawyer look into it." Thomas sat down. He set his hat on the table, then moved it off the table onto his knee, apparently deciding the table was too much familiarity. Miss Whitmore. "If he takes the creek water." "I know what happens if he takes the creek water," she said. Her voice came out flatter than she intended. She poured the tea when the kettle was ready and set a cup in front of him and kept one for herself. "Did your mother know you were coming to tell me this?" "She sent me," he said. "She thought you should know before you heard it from someone less friendly." That was Nora. Eliza felt a particular kind of gratitude that didn't have a clean word attached to it. The gratitude for a person who thinks about what you need before you know you need it. "All right," she said. "I need to get to Miles City." "Today?" "Today." Thomas drank his tea fast, the way young men do everything, and they were on the road within the hour. The county recorder's office was a small room attached to the back of the courthouse in Miles City, run by a man named Gerald Fitch, who had held the position for 22 years and treated every inquiry as a personal inconvenience. He was not unkind. Exactly, he was the kind of person who had been doing the same thing for so long that any deviation from routine registered as an attack on his sense of order. Eliza had dealt with Fitch before. She knew how to handle him, which was to be extremely specific about what she wanted, extremely patient while he found it, and extremely unreactive to the sighing. "Whitmore homestead claim," she said, "and the original survey documents for the land parcel, going back as far as the records go." Fitch sighed. He went to the back room. Thomas stood near the door, looking at notices pinned to a board. Eliza stood at the counter and kept her face arranged into something that communicated patience she did not entirely feel. Took 40 minutes. When Fitch came back, he had a folder of documents, some of them fragile enough that he handled them with visible reluctance, as though they might disintegrate and he would be held responsible. He spread them on the counter. Eliza read carefully. There was an old survey from 1871. There was a water access notation. She found it on the third page, handwritten in faded ink, in language that was precise in the way old legal documents were precise. Technical and narrow and absolutely clear about what it said. What it said was that the creek access was tied to a cattle grazing agreement that had lapsed in 1884. She read it twice. Then she asked Fitch for a piece of paper and copied the relevant section by hand, word for word. "Can I ask who else has looked at these documents recently?" she said. Fitch gave her the sigh again, but he checked his logbook. A man from a law office in Billings. 2 weeks ago. 2 weeks. Pruitt had been planning this for 2 weeks before he sent the rumor through the feed store. She thought about that, the deliberateness of it, the patience, and felt a cold, focused anger settle in somewhere below her sternum. Not the hot kind that made you say things you regretted. Cold kind that made you very precise. She thanked Fitch and walked out with Thomas. "Well," he said on the steps, "the water access claim is based on a grazing agreement that hasn't been valid for 30 years, she said. "But that doesn't mean he can't tie it up in legal proceedings long enough to cause me real problems." She looked at the street. Miles City in July was dusty and blunt and in motion. Wagons, horses, men moving with the purposeful lean of people who had somewhere to be. "I need a lawyer." Thomas looked uncertain. "That's expensive." "I know." She started walking. "Come on. I have one more stop." The one more stop was the office of a man named Wallace Bream, who ran the smallest law practice in Miles City and was known, according to Nora, for being willing to work on arrangements when cash was short. He was an older man, wiry and sharp-eyed, with an office that looked like a paper storm had moved through it and settled permanently. She laid out the situation in 10 minutes. She showed him the copied notation. She told him about Pruitt's history with the land and the timing of the lawyer's visit to the recorder's office. Bream listened with his chin in his hand. When she finished, he was quiet for a moment, reading the copied language. "The lapse clause is clear," he said. "But clear doesn't always mean fast. If Pruitt's lawyer files for a review, you're looking at months of proceedings, possibly into next year. I can't have the water tied up into next year." "No," he agreed. He leaned back. "I can file a preemptive response. Get your claim on record formally before he moves. Make it harder for any proceedings to cloud the title without going through me first." He looked at her steadily. "My fee is $12 to file, and $20 for the first round of proceedings if it goes that far." $12 she had, $20 she would have to find. "File the preemptive response," she said. "If it goes further, we'll have that conversation." "Fair enough." He started writing. He paused. "Pruitt's been acquiring a lot of land in this county, Miss Whitmore. Quietly and persistently. You're not the first property he's looked at sideways. I know that. I mention it because in my experience men who operate that way tend to escalate when they find resistance. It's worth knowing." "I already knew it," she said. "I appreciate you saying it anyway." She rode back with Thomas in the late afternoon, the sun behind them, the road long and pale with dust. Thomas was quiet for a while, which she appreciated. Then, when they were perhaps 5 miles out, he said, "Do you ever think about just going somewhere else? Starting over?" She considered the question seriously, because he had asked it seriously. "Sometimes in the bad weeks. But you don't. No." "How come?" She thought about it for a moment. The land was ahead of her in the distance. She couldn't see it yet, but she knew exactly where it was, the way you know where something is when you've walked its edges enough times. Because somewhere else would just be somewhere else with different problems. And I'd be starting over on someone else's terms. She paused. "Here at least, the problems are mine." Thomas thought about that. "That's a strange way to look at it." "Probably," she said. They rode the rest of the way without talking. August came in hard. The heat was the particular Montana kind that seemed personal, not just hot but oppressive, as though the land itself was pressing down. The creek dropped to nothing in the first week, which Eliza had expected, and she doubled her water hauling. Her right arm stopped aching only because it had moved into a kind of permanent numbness that concerned her a little when she thought about it, and so she tried not to think about it too often. The Beaumont horses were changing. It was not dramatic. There was no single moment she could point to. But Decker the bay stallion, who had bruised her shoulder in April, had developed a habit of moving toward her when she entered his space rather than away from it. He was not gentle. He was not what anyone would call manageable in the ordinary sense. But there was something happening in his understanding of her that was different from what had been there before. Clara was further along. Clara had turned out to be, underneath the damage and the suspicion, a horse of remarkable intelligence. She learned patterns quickly. She responded to Eliza's posture as much as her voice, which meant she was paying a different kind of attention, whole-body attention, the kind that indicated genuine engagement rather than trained compliance. Thomas had started documenting things at Eliza's direction, keeping notes in a small journal she'd given him. Times, behaviors, changes. What worked and what didn't. She was building something she could look back at. A record of method rather than just instinct. Clara did that thing again today, he said one afternoon, sitting on the fence rail while Eliza worked in the pen, where she anticipates the direction before you move. What time? He checked his notes. Both times were in the late afternoon. Around 4. Eliza filed that away. Light quality, temperature, routine, there were a dozen variables, and she was still sorting which ones mattered. Write down the light conditions, too, where the sun is relative to the pen. You think that's it? I think everything is something until it isn't. She moved slowly across the pen, staying in her peripheral relationship with Clara rather than direct. The mistake most people make with horses like this is assuming that what they know applies. It doesn't. You have to let the animal teach you what matters to it. Thomas wrote that down too. She noticed but didn't comment. What she didn't tell him, because she was still working out whether she believed it entirely, was that what she was developing felt like something. Not just a method for managing difficult animals, something with wider application. A way of understanding how damage worked in a living creature and what it took to work around it, without compounding it. She was not a scientific woman in the formal sense, but she had always been systematic, and the system she was building had logic to it. She just needed time to prove it worked. Time was the variable she had the least of. The letter from Pruitt's lawyer arrived on a Thursday in late August. It was delivered by a courier who clearly found the errand beneath him. He handed it to her at the gate with the expression of a man who has been sent to deliver news to someone who doesn't matter and knows it. She took it without comment and waited until he was gone to open it. The letter was 3 pages of legal language that took her 2 readings to fully parse. What it said, stripped of its elaborate phrasing, was that Pruitt's lawyers were filing a formal inquiry into the historical water rights associated with the creek on her north section, and that pending the outcome of this inquiry, she should consider arrangements for alternative water sourcing. She put the letter on the kitchen table and sat down. Wallace Bream had warned her this was possible. She had filed the preemptive response 3 weeks ago. This was the escalation Bream had predicted Pruitt, pushing back, testing whether she would fold under the weight of formal legal process. She thought about the $12 she'd spent on the filing. She thought about the $20 she might still need. She went to the tin box and counted what was there. She sat with the number for a while. Then she picked up the letter and reread it a 3rd time, this time marking the specific language she needed to discuss with Bream. She was not going to fold, but she was also not going to be careless. Carelessness was a luxury for people who could afford to recover from mistakes, and she was not currently in that position. She wrote to Bream that evening. The reply came a week later, and it was cautiously encouraging. The preemptive filing was holding Pruitt's inquiry, was being forced to move through proper channels rather than being fast-tracked the way his lawyer had apparently hoped. This bought time. Bream estimated months, though he was careful not to promise outcomes. Months was something. Months was workable, if she could solve the feed problem and keep the horses through to fall. She had been thinking about the feed problem from 3 directions. First was reducing consumption, which she had ruled out for the reasons she'd already worked through. The second was finding additional income. She'd had 2 inquiries from neighboring properties about horse training work, small jobs that would bring in something. She had said yes to both, which meant more hours on top of the hours she already didn't have. The third direction was the one she was least sure about and most interested in. There was a livestock exhibition in Miles City at the end of September. Smaller than the big territorial events, but attended by buyers, breeders, ranchers from a broad region. She had never shown horses there before, had never had horses worth showing. But Clara was different now. Clara, in 4 months, had transformed from a damaged, dangerous animal that Pruitt's hands hadn't been able to touch into something that worked with a rider, in ways that experienced horsewomen would recognize as unusual. She began preparing Clara for exhibition in early September. It was hard work. Not the training itself that was proceeding in its own rhythm, the slow accumulation of trust, but the preparation for a public environment, which was an entirely different challenge. Exhibitions were loud. They were crowded. They involved strangers and strange smells and the particular tension of animals and people in close proximity, all wanting different things. Clara had started from a place of profound distrust. Loud and crowded were exactly the conditions most likely to undo everything Eliza had built. "You're going to show her," Thomas said. It wasn't a question. He had a habit of stating things that were decisions as statements, which she'd found was his way of giving her the option to either confirm or explain. "I'm going to try," she said. "What if it doesn't work? Then I learn something and try differently next time." She adjusted the lines she was working with. "But I think it'll work." "How do you know?" "I don't," she said. "Think. There's still a difference." He made a sound that was almost a laugh. He was doing that more often now, not fully laughing, but getting close to it. She took that as a good sign. The training incident happened on a Wednesday. She had been working Clara in the West Pen for an hour, the kind of sustained session that was going well, Clara responding. Attentive, the communication between them running the way it did on good days. Thomas was at the fence taking notes. The afternoon light was doing what Thomas had documented, coming in at the angle that seemed to matter to Clara, and everything was moving the way it moved on, days when you thought maybe you were actually figuring something out. Then Pruitt's foreman rode through the north section. He had no right to be there. The property lines were clear. But he came through the fence gap that Eliza had been meaning to repair for 2 weeks and rode across the north corner at a pace that was too fast and too deliberate to be accidental. Clara heard the hoofbeats before Eliza did. The mare's entire posture changed in an instant, back to something that looked terrifyingly like the animal from April, the one that had been beyond reaching, and Eliza felt 4 months of work teetering on a single moment. She made a decision in half a second. She didn't react to the foreman. She kept every part of her attention on Clara, kept her own body language steady, moved in the way she'd learned to move, not rushing toward the horse, not retreating, staying in the conversation. "Hey," she said. She said it the way she'd been saying it for months, the particular tone, the particular weight of it. "Hey, I'm here." Clara's eyes were on the retreating shape of the foreman's horse. Her sides were heaving. Everything in her was screaming back toward old instinct. "Hey," Eliza said again. Thomas at the fence was completely still. She was aware of that in the periphery. He understood not to move. It took 4 minutes. She knew because Thomas told her later. She had lost track of time entirely in the concentration of it. 4 minutes of staying steady, of keeping the line between them the way it was supposed to be, of not letting her own alarm about Pruitt's foreman and what it meant translate into anything Clara could read. And then Clara came back. Not dramatically, not in a way that would have looked like much from the outside. She just shifted her attention from the direction the foreman had gone and moved it back to Eliza, and her breathing slowed, and the terrible rigidity went out of her muscles. Eliza let out a breath she'd been holding for 4 minutes. Thomas exhaled audibly. "That was write it down," she said. Her voice came out rougher than she intended. All of it. Every second of it. He was already writing. She went to Clara and stood with her for a long time, not asking for anything, just being present. Her hands were steadier than she felt. That was a thing she'd gotten good at, keeping the outside of herself different from the inside when it was necessary. Later, after Thomas had gone home, she rode out to the north fence gap. She looked at where the foreman's tracks came in and where they went out. The tracks were purposeful. He'd come through at speed, cut across the north corner, and gone out the east side. It had taken less than 3 minutes, just long enough to cause damage, if damage was what you were after. She repaired the fence that evening by lantern light. She was still angry when she went to bed. She let herself be angry then, in the private dark, because anger had its uses. It kept you from accepting things that shouldn't be accepted. But she kept it controlled, the way she kept the outside of herself controlled, because uncontrolled anger made you stupid, and she could not afford to be stupid. She thought about what Bream had said. Men who operate that way tend to escalate when they find resistance. She was going to the exhibition. She wrote to 2 people that week. The first was Wallace Bream, describing the trespass and asking about her options. Bream wrote back promptly, he always did, which she appreciated, and told her that a single incident of unclear intent was difficult to act on formally, but that documenting it was essential, and she should note the date, time, and direction of the foreman's route. She already had. Thomas's notes had it. The second letter was harder to write. It was to a woman named Agnes Colworth in Billings, whom Eliza had met once at a county gathering 3 years ago and had not had occasion to contact since. Agnes ran a small breeding operation outside Billings and was known quietly within the circles where these things were known for having opinions on horse training that differed substantially from the standard approaches. She was also known for having money, though Eliza was not writing to her about that. She was writing because Agnes had said something 3 years ago that Eliza had never forgotten. She had said it in passing, during a conversation about a horse that had been deemed unworkable by 3 different handlers. Some animals just need someone willing to start from the animal's logic instead of their own. Eliza had thought about that sentence for 3 years. She wrote to Agnes, describing what she had been doing with the Beaumont horses and what she had observed. She described her methods in as much detail as she could in a letter. She described what had happened with Clara that afternoon and what it had told her about the kind of resilience that could be built in an animal that everyone else had written off. She was not asking for money. She was asking for she thought about the word for a while and settled on correspondence. Conversation between people thinking about the same problem from different angles. She sent the letter and put it out of her mind because expecting things from letters was a way to spend energy she didn't have on possibilities she couldn't control. The exhibition was in 3 weeks. She had work to do. The week before the exhibition, a man named Dale Sutton came by. Sutton ran a small operation 12 miles east, not as large as Pruitt's, not as aggressive, just a working ranch that had been in his family for 2 generations. He was a quiet man, somewhere in his 50s, with the particular economy of movement that came from decades of physical work. She had spoken to him perhaps 4 times since coming to the property. He came in the afternoon, rode up to the yard, dismounted carefully the way older men with bad knees do. He took his hat off. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Sutton." She didn't stop what she was doing, which was checking Rue's left foreleg. There had been some heat in it the last 2 days. There was probably nothing, but needed watching. "Something I can help you with?" "Maybe the other way around," he said. He stood at the fence, watching her work with an expression she couldn't immediately read. "I heard about the water rights business." She didn't look up. News travels, always does. He was quiet for a moment. "My west well taps the same aquifer that feeds your creek. I've got water rights on record going back to the 1870s. Clean and clear." He paused. "If you run into supply problems before Bream gets this sorted, you can run a line from my west well. Won't cost you." Eliza straightened and looked at him. He met her eyes with the direct gaze of a man who was not offering charity and wanted that understood. He was offering neighbor assistance, which was a different category on the frontier, a thing that came with no obligation attached, except the general and unspoken understanding that the frontier was hard, and sometimes people needed things, and that didn't make them lesser. She understood that distinction. "That's a generous offer," she said carefully. "It's a practical one," he said. "Pruitt's been putting pressure on parcels all across this side of the county. He gets yours. He'll come for the smaller operations next." He settled his hat back on his head. "I'd rather you stayed." He rode out without another word. She watched him go with a feeling she couldn't immediately name, not relief, not quite. Something more complicated. The frontier was not kind to women who wanted to run things. She had always known that. But it was not entirely unkind either. And the parts that weren't unkind showed up in strange ways when you weren't looking for them. She went back to Rue's leg. The heat was still there, mild and probably harmless, but she made a note. The evening before the exhibition, she sat in the barn with Clara, not working, not preparing anything, just sitting on an overturned bucket with her back against the stall boards, and Clara loose in the space, moving around in the way horses move when they're settled slow and purposeful, occasionally stopping to register something with their nose. Eliza was tired in the bone-deep way that had become her ordinary condition. Her arm ached. Her finances were in a state that required not thinking about directly, or the numbers became paralyzing. Bream's proceedings were holding but unresolved. The feed situation had been partially addressed by the training work she'd taken on, but not fully. And tomorrow she was going to take a horse that 4 months ago had been considered dangerous and beyond salvaging into a crowded exhibition yard in Miles City, and she was going to demonstrate something she believed was true about what careful attention could build. Clara stopped near her and stood. Horses didn't look directly at people the way dogs did. Their eyes were positioned differently, built for a wider view. But there was a way Clara oriented toward her that communicated attention, and she was doing it now. "I know," Eliza said. The barn was quiet. Outside, the Montana dark was the particular dark of the plains, deep and large and without much softness to it. She was not sure what tomorrow would bring. She was almost sure she was right about Clara. Almost sure was not the same as certain, and she had learned not to confuse them. What she was certain about was that she had done the work. Whatever happened at the exhibition, whatever Pruitt's next move turned out to be, whatever the fall taxes demanded, she had done the work, and it was real, and it was hers. She sat with Clara in the dark for another half hour. Then she stood up, brushed the barn dust off her clothes, checked the water, and feed one more time with the lantern, and went to the house to sleep. Tomorrow was going to be long. She needed to be ready. The morning of the exhibition arrived gray and cold. The kind of September morning that reminded you winter was not a distant threat but a patient one, already making its arrangements somewhere to the north. Eliza was up before 4. She had slept in the fragmented way she always slept before something important, not badly. Exactly, but lightly, the way a person sleeps when part of their mind refuses to fully let go of what's coming. She dressed in the dark, ate something she didn't taste, and was in the barn with a lantern before the sky had begun to consider changing color. Clara was awake. Horses often knew when something was different before the people around them did, and Clara was better at that than most. She was alert in the stall, watching the lantern with her ears forward. "All right," Eliza said. "Here we go." She spent an hour with Clara before they loaded up, not working, not preparing in any formal sense, just moving through the routines they had built together over 4 months. The familiar rhythms of it, the language between them that didn't have words. She had found, through trial and error, and a fair amount of error, that Clara did better when the morning of a stressful event looked as much like an ordinary morning as possible, not ignoring what was coming, just not announcing it either. Thomas arrived at 5:30, earlier than she'd asked, and helped load Clara into the borrowed wagon without being asked to do any particular thing. He just read what needed doing and did it, which was one of his better qualities. They drove to Miles City in the early light, the plains opening out wide and quiet around them, the kind of quiet that felt like the land holding its breath. Clara moved in the wagon with more calm than Eliza had dared hope for. She stood and found her balance and watched the passing country with the particular focused attention she brought to everything. "She's good," Thomas said, watching the mare from the bench seat. "She is today," Eliza said. "Ask me again in 2 hours." The exhibition grounds were already in motion when they arrived, livestock being unloaded, handlers calling to each other across the yards, the smell of animals and hay and trampled ground that was the specific smell of these events everywhere. Eliza had been to enough of them to know that the first 20 minutes were the most important. If Clara could get through the initial assault of noise and movement and strange smells without reverting, they had a chance. She led Clara from the wagon herself. Thomas stayed back, which was the right instinct, fewer variables. Eliza kept her own breathing deliberate and her pace steady, and she talked in the low, continuous way she'd developed over months, not saying anything particular, just keeping the channel between them open. Clara's were working hard. Her eyes were wide, but she was walking. A man near the gate, heavyset, with the kind of professional assessor's expression that came with years of buying and selling animals, looked at Clara as they passed, and then looked at Eliza. "That a Beaumont horse?" Eliza glanced at him. He watched them walk past. She didn't look back to see his expression. They found their assigned space in the exhibition yard. Thomas caught up with them and set up the equipment they'd brought. Simple things, the tools of her training work. Nothing elaborate. She had not come to put on a performance. She had come to demonstrate something real, and real things didn't require elaborate staging. She gave Clara 40 minutes to settle. This was the part that had worried her most, in the planning, that Clara would need more time than the exhibition schedule allowed, or that the settling would never fully come, and she'd be asking the mayor to work from a state of unresolved anxiety. Clara, given the 40 minutes and Eliza's continued quiet presence, came down from the high alertness of arrival to something more like watchful. Not relaxed. Clara was never precisely relaxed in new places, but present, engaged, and in the conversation they began at 10. The demonstration was not dramatic in the way exhibitions sometimes were, the showy performances that played to crowds and made ordinary people gasp. What Eliza showed was precision. She moved Clara through a series of exercises that revealed, to anyone who understood what they were looking at, the depth of the communication between them. Clara responding to weight shifts so subtle they were invisible to most observers. Clara anticipating directions from postural changes rather than overt commands. Clara stopping and starting and changing pace with the kind of attentiveness that looked like and was genuine partnership rather than trained compliance. She was aware of people watching. She didn't look at them directly, because looking away from Clara to manage an audience was the kind of split attention that Clara would notice. But in the periphery, she registered a growing cluster near the fence. The assessor from the gate. 2 men she didn't recognize in good coats that indicated money. A woman whose precise, assessing posture reminded her, with a small start, of the description she carried in her mind of Agnes Colworth. Halfway through the demonstration, something went wrong. A dog, some handler's working dog, loose and oblivious, came skidding through the gap in the exhibition fence and cut directly across the yard at speed, chasing something only it could see. Came within 20 feet of Clara and was gone again in 3 seconds. Clara stopped. Every muscle in the mare went rigid. Her head came up. Eliza felt the familiar and terrifying shift of attention, Clara going somewhere else. Back to the place where everything was a threat and nothing could be trusted. 3 seconds of silence. Eliza did not move fast. She did not try to correct or redirect with pressure. She brought herself back to the thing that had worked in the pen when Pruitt's foreman had ridden through the particular quality of presence, the specific weight of attention that she had learned to put into her voice without urgency. "Hey," she said. Just that. The cluster at the fence went absolutely quiet. Clara's ears moved. Her sides were heaving. "Hey," Eliza said again. "I'm here." 4 seconds. 5. The longest 5 seconds she could remember standing through. And Clara came back. Not all the way. Not immediately. She was still heightened. Still wary. Her attention moving around the yard like a searchlight. But she came back to Eliza's voice. Came back to the conversation. And Eliza was able to move her forward with a pressure so gentle that the watching cluster of people murmured among themselves in a sound that she registered only as general, because she was still entirely focused on the mare. They finished the demonstration. When Eliza finally looked up, there were more people at the fence than she'd expected. The woman who might be Agnes Colworth was there, closer now, with an expression that wasn't quite excitement. Something more controlled than that, but engaged in a way that looked genuine. The 2 men in good coats were talking quietly to each other. The assessor from the gate was watching Eliza with the calculating look of a man revising a number upward. Thomas was at the far fence, and she could see from 100 feet away that he was grinning. The woman was Agnes Colworth. She came around to the gate after Eliza had finished and introduced herself with the brisk directness of someone who valued her own time. She was perhaps 60, with white hair, and the kind of face that had settled into its lines without complaint. She had, Eliza noticed, the particular posture of a person who has spent most of their life around horses upright, balanced with an unconscious readiness about the hips and shoulders. "I got your letter," Agnes said. "I wasn't sure if you'd received it," Eliza said. She was walking Clara back toward their station, and Agnes fell into step beside her, without being invited, which seemed to be her way. "I received it 3 weeks ago. I've been thinking about it since." Agnes looked at Clara with the focused attention of genuine assessment. What happened with the dog? Not ideal timing. No. But more useful than a clean demonstration would have been. Agnes reached out a hand toward Clara, not grabbing, just offering, and waited. Clara regarded the hand for a moment, then allowed contact. She reads your stillness, Agnes said. Not just your movement. Yes. Eliza had noticed that herself, but hadn't said it in those words before. She tracks the quality of my attention. Agnes looked at her. How many of the Beaumont horses do you have? 6. Clara's the furthest along. Decker, one of the stallions, is where Clara was about 2 months ago. And the others coming, at their own pace. She paused. Which is the only pace that works. Agnes was quiet for a moment. They reached the station, and Eliza began the settling routine water, familiar movements, bringing Clara back down from the residual adrenaline of the dog incident. Agnes watched without speaking, which was, Eliza found, a pleasant quality in a person. I'd like to come to your property, Agnes said finally. See the operation. See the others. You're welcome to, Eliza said carefully. It's not what most people would call an operation. Not yet. What would you call it? Eliza thought about it. A theory being tested. Agnes smiled, a brief, genuine thing. Those are usually more interesting anyway. They made an arrangement for the following week. Agnes rode back to wherever she'd come from, and Eliza stood with Clara in the exhibition yard and let herself feel for approximately 60 seconds, something close to hope. Then she put it away because hope was the kind of thing that needed to be kept in proportion, or it became its own problem. Thomas appeared at her shoulder. Who was that? Someone who might matter, Eliza said. Help me with the water. The 2 men in good coats found her before she left the exhibition grounds. They introduced themselves as partners in a livestock trading operation, based out of Helena, larger than anything in this county, with connections across the territory. Their names were Foster and Crane, and they had the particular practiced ease of men who were comfortable making and discussing money in any setting. We watched your demonstration, Foster said. He was the taller one, with a neatly trimmed beard and the kind of direct gaze that either meant confidence or was a performance of it. Impressive animal. More impressive recovery. Thank you, Eliza said. She kept her tone level. She had learned that level tone with men like this was more effective than warmth. Warmth sometimes got interpreted as eagerness, and eagerness gave away negotiating position. We have clients who are always in the market for horses with that kind of trainability, Crane said. He was shorter, rounder, with the kind of face that seemed designed to appear harmless. The kind that can work with a rider the way yours was working today. It's not common. No, Eliza agreed. It isn't. We'd be interested in discussing a purchasing arrangement, Foster said. Not just this animal. If your methods produce consistent results, we could potentially be looking at an ongoing relationship. Eliza looked at both of them. She could feel Thomas behind her, very still, listening. Clara isn't for sale, she said. She's the demonstration, not the product. She paused a beat. But I'm willing to have a conversation about what an ongoing arrangement might look like. Not today. When you've had time to think about what you actually want, and I've had time to think about whether it fits what I'm building. Foster looked at Crane. Something passed between them, recalibration, she thought. They had expected either a quick sale or a refusal, and she had given them neither. Fair, Foster said. He produced a card. Write to us when you're ready. She took the card. She put it in her pocket without looking at it. I will. They left, Thomas exhaled. Did you just? Yes, she said. You didn't even look at their card. I'll look at it tonight, she said. Looking at it in front of them tells them something I don't want them to know yet. He thought about that. What does it tell them? That I need them more than they need me. She began packing up their equipment. Right now, I want them thinking it's the other way around. He picked up the other end of the equipment without being asked. Is it? She considered the honest answer. Not yet, she said, but it could be. They drove back in the late afternoon, Clara settled and quiet in the wagon, the September light going gold and long across the plains. Eliza was tired in the good way, the way you were tired when something had gone well, mostly, with enough complications to make the going well feel real rather than easy. She was also thinking about Pruitt. He had not been at the exhibition, or she hadn't seen him, which might have been the same thing, or might not. But the exhibition was exactly the kind of event where word traveled who showed how buyers reacted, what was worth attention. By tomorrow morning, there would be people in this county who knew that Eliza Whitmer had demonstrated something with a Beaumont horse that made buyers from Helena ask questions. That information would reach Pruitt. She had been thinking for some time about what Pruitt would do when he understood that she was not going to fold and not going to leave, and was in fact beginning to build something real. She had run through the possibilities enough times that they were familiar to her now, each one with its own shape and its own required response. He could escalate the legal proceedings, which Bream was prepared for. He could attempt to acquire horses or clients she was developing relationships with, which she was less prepared for, but had thought about. Or he could wait. Waiting was the strategy that worried her most, because time and resources were the dimensions where he had the overwhelming advantage. He could simply maintain pressure, legal, social, the small harassments like his foreman through her fence, and let the accumulated weight of running an underfunded operation on difficult land do his work for him. She was thinking about this when Thomas said, "There was someone watching you at the exhibition." She looked at him. Many people were watching. Not like this, he kept his eyes on the road. A man I didn't recognize. Not a buyer, he wasn't dressed like that. He was watching you, not the horse. From the north side of the grounds near the equipment shed. He was there the whole time. Eliza turned this over. What did he look like? Tall. Dark coat. He had a way of standing. Thomas paused, working for the word. Like he was trying not to be seen, but he wasn't very good at it. Did you see who he spoke to? Nobody. He left before the demonstration finished. She filed it. Maybe nothing. Maybe a scout for Pruitt, checking on what she was doing. Maybe someone else entirely. The frontier had many species of watchers, and not all of them were connected to anything that mattered. But she didn't dismiss it. She kept it, where she kept things she hadn't figured out yet, in a part of her mind that ran quietly in the background like a low fire. Agnes Colworth arrived on a Tuesday 8 days after the exhibition, in a wagon that was considerably better than the one Eliza had borrowed to transport Clara. She brought a young woman with her, an assistant, introduced as Miriam, who had the competent, self-contained manner of someone who had figured out how to be useful in any situation. Agnes walked the property the way Eliza's father had taught her to walk land slowly, paying attention. She didn't say much while she looked. She looked at the western section for a long time, which told Eliza that Agnes was seeing what she had always seen there, and felt a quiet satisfaction that had nothing to do with pride and everything to do with having been right about something for 4 years with no confirmation. The western section, Agnes said. Yes, that's where you'd expand. That's where I'd breed, Eliza said. Expand comes later. The western section first, then if the breeding program produces what I think it will, the eastern section can be improved over time. It's not unsalvageable. It just needs different handling than it's gotten. Agnes looked at her. You've thought about this in detail. I've had time, Eliza said, and not much else to spend it on. Agnes's expression did something not quite a smile. Something more specific than that. Recognition, maybe. The look of a person encountering something they know from the inside. They spent the rest of the morning with the horses. Agnes worked with each of the Beaumont animals in turn, not directing so much as making observations, noting what she saw, asking Eliza questions that were the right questions, the ones that assumed knowledge and wanted detail rather than explanation. Miriam took notes without being asked. With Decker, Agnes was careful and watched Eliza's approach carefully before attempting any contact herself. Decker regarded Agnes with the focused suspicion he brought to strangers, but he allowed proximity, which 4 months ago would not have been possible. You said in your letter that the key was starting from the animal's logic, Agnes said, standing outside Decker's fence line. What does that mean in practice? Concretely. Eliza thought about how to answer it in a way that was accurate rather than just interesting. Most training starts from what we need the horse to do. We build the training around the human requirement. With an animal like Decker, like any of these, but especially Decker, that approach fails because the animal's experience of humans is that humans impose. And imposition means danger. She paused. So I started from what Decker was already doing. What his existing behavior was telling me about how he understood his situation. And I built from there, not trying to replace his logic with mine, trying to find where our logics could run parallel. Agnes was quiet for a moment, and when they don't run parallel, when what the animal needs and what the training requires are genuinely in conflict, then you slow down, Eliza said. And you figure out why they're in conflict. Because usually the conflict tells you something you missed. And if there isn't time to slow down, then you haven't prepared well enough. Eliza said, which is usually the real problem. Agnes looked at her steadily. I'd like to invest in what you're building here, she said. The words landed in the air between them. Eliza had been half expecting something in this direction and had not allowed herself to expect it fully, which meant she felt it now with a force she hadn't prepared for. She kept her face steady. What does that mean to you specifically? She said. It means capital, Agnes said. For feed, for fence repair, for the legal proceedings, yes. I know about Bream and Pruitt. Bream is an old acquaintance, and for the expansion into the western section, when you're ready. In exchange for a stake in the breeding program and the right to place horses from that program with buyers in my network. She paused. I'm not interested in ownership of the land or the operation. I'm interested in what your methods produce. That's where the value is. Eliza looked out at the western section. At the land she had walked 4 years ago and seen something in that nobody else had seen. The horses moving in the morning light. I need to think about it, she said. Agnes nodded. Of course. I'm not saying no. I know you're not, Agnes said. I'd think less of you if you didn't take time. They went back to the horses. That evening, after Agnes and Miriam had gone, Eliza sat with her tin box. She took out the deed. She took out her notes, months of them, the careful documentation of everything she'd tried and observed and adjusted. She took out Wallace Bream's last letter, and Foster and Crane's card, and a water bill that was overdue by 2 weeks. She laid them all on the table and looked at them. Agnes's offer was real. She had turned it over all afternoon while they worked, checking it from different angles, the way you checked a fence line, looking for the weak points, the places where it might fail under pressure. She hadn't found any that were disqualifying. The terms were clear. Agnes wanted a stake in the program, not control of the land. The distinction mattered enormously. The risk was dependency. She had been making decisions alone since Caleb left, and there was something in that she valued in ways she hadn't fully articulated, even to herself. Not pride exactly, she'd been careful about pride, knowing it could make you stupid. Something more like clarity. When you were the only one making decisions, you always knew why a decision was made, and you could trace the logic of it. Bringing in a partner meant shared logic, and shared logic could drift. But the alternative, managing Pruitt's legal proceedings, the feed costs, the expansion, all of it alone on her current resources, the mathematics of that were not favorable. She had been running on stubbornness and calculation for months, and she was good at both, but stubbornness and calculation couldn't replace capital when capital was what you actually needed. She wrote to Agnes that night. She accepted the investment with 2 conditions. The operational decisions regarding training methods would remain entirely hers, and any expansion into the western section would happen on her timeline, determined by the readiness of the program rather than by external financial pressure. She sealed the letter and set it on the table to go out in the morning. Then she sat for a while longer. The night outside was getting colder. She could feel it through the walls of the house, the particular cold that came in September in Montana, the first clear announcement of what was approaching. She had been through 4 winters on this land. She knew what they looked like, what they required. This winter was going to be different from the others. She didn't know exactly how yet, but she could feel it, the way Clara felt things through attention, through the quality of what the air was doing, through the accumulated information of everything she had been paying attention to for 4 years. She put the tin box back on the shelf. The first real trouble of October arrived not from Pruitt, but from the weather. A cold front came down from the north the second week of the month, with less warning than the signs had suggested, and by the time it fully settled in, the temperature had dropped 40 degrees in 36 hours, and there was ice on the water troughs by morning. The horses were the immediate priority. She had been preparing for winter, but not for winter this early, and the preparation was not complete. One of the barn structures still had gaps that needed weatherproofing. The feed supply was better than it had been, but still not where she wanted it to be, and 2 of the Beaumont horses, Rue, and one of the other mares she'd named Beck, were showing stress responses to the cold that concerned her. She worked for 3 days, without sleeping more than 4 hours a night. Thomas came and stayed, sleeping in the barn, which Nora had apparently approved with the knowledge that the situation was what it was. He worked without direction, which was his best quality, reading what needed doing and doing it. On the 3rd night, with the temperature still dropping and the wind coming hard out of the northwest, Decker got loose. She didn't know how. She had checked the pen twice that evening, had checked the latches personally. But at 2 in the morning she heard something wrong in the sounds from outside horses. Don't make the sounds they were making when everything is right, and she pulled on her coat and boots and went out with the lantern. Decker was in the yard. Not panicked. That was the strange thing, the thing she would think about afterward. He was standing in the dark yard with the wind coming hard, and he was not calm exactly, but contained. Present, his head was up and his attention was moving, but he had not run. She stood at the edge of the barn door for a moment, assessing. If she moved too fast, she would lose him. The nearest fence line was the north section, Sutton's direction, 50 yards of open ground in the dark and the cold and the wind. If Decker decided to move before she could establish contact, she would be chasing him through the night and possibly through the fence and onto the open plain. She took a breath. She walked out into the yard, not toward him directly at an angle, the way she'd learned to move in his space, so that her approach didn't register as pursuit. She talked as she walked, the low continuous talk that wasn't words but was language. Decker's head turned toward her. She kept walking, kept talking. The wind was cutting, and the lantern was swinging and throwing light in all directions, and her hands were already cold because she'd come out without gloves. He was watching her. She stopped 15 feet from him and just stood. Let him make the next move. He took a step toward her. She let out a breath that the wind immediately took. He took another step, and another. And then, in a thing that she had worked toward for months, without knowing exactly when it would arrive, he came the rest of the way to her, closed the distance, and put his head near her shoulder with the focused, deliberate stillness of an animal that had decided, finally, that this was a place worth trusting. She stood with him in the dark and the cold for a long moment. Then she walked him back to the pen, checked the latch twice aboard, had warped enough to slip, which was the answer to how, and fixed it with what she had on hand, which was wire and the kind of improvisation that 4 years of frontier ranching produced. Thomas appeared at the barn door, half awake and alarmed. "What fixed?" she said. "Go back to sleep." He looked at Decker, who was now standing calmly in the pen. He looked at her. "He came to you." "Yes." "In the middle of the night." "In a storm." "Yes." She looked at Decker a moment longer. "Write it down in the morning." She went back inside. Her hands were shaking from the cold, she told herself, which was partially true. Agnes's investment came through in late October. The amount was more than Eliza had asked for, and she sat with the bank draft for a long time, trying to decide how she felt about that. Too much felt like obligation. Agnes had framed it not as generosity but as calculation. She had looked at what the program actually needed to develop properly and funded that number rather than a negotiated down version of it. Eliza wrote back acknowledging receipt and outlining exactly how the money would be allocated, item by item. She sent a copy to Bream as well, on the grounds that transparency in financial matters was worth the effort even when nobody was requiring it. Bream wrote back with news of his own. Pruitt's water rights inquiry had stalled, not resolved in Eliza's favor. Not dismissed, but stalled, which in legal proceedings had its own kind of meaning. Pruitt's lawyer had apparently encountered more resistance than expected in the historical documents, which supported what the 1,871 survey had shown and what Eliza had known since her afternoon in Fitch's office. "He may drop it," Bream wrote, "or he may find a different angle. With men like Pruitt, it is often the case that the specific tactic matters less than the sustained pressure. Do not assume withdrawal on this front means withdrawal generally." She didn't assume that. She filed the information and adjusted her thinking accordingly. The feed situation with Agnes's investment was no longer critical. She ordered what she needed for the winter and had it delivered to Sutton's operation. He had offered his barn for overflow storage. Another of the quiet practical gestures that she had come to understand was simply how he operated, and she felt something loosen in her chest that had been tight since August. She was still not safe. The land was still contested in some operational sense, even if the legal position was holding. Pruitt was still Pruitt. The winter was only beginning, and Montana winters had a way of finding the weaknesses in whatever you'd built, the same way water found the low places. But she was still here. The horses were here. The western section was waiting, patient as it had always been, for what she was building toward. She went out to the barn in the early evening, when the light was going and the cold was settling in for another night. And she walked the line of stalls, Clara, Decker, Rue, Beck, the others, each of them known to her now, the way you knew something that had cost you something real. She stopped at Decker's stall. He regarded her with the focused attention that had replaced the aggression of 6 months ago. Not tame, not soft, just present in the conversation. "You know what I think?" she said. Decker's ears moved. "I think spring is going to be something." She didn't know exactly what spring was going to bring, but she was going to be here for it. And that felt, on this particular November evening with the cold coming and the work still enormous and the future still uncertain, like more than enough to hold on to. She checked the latches, all of them, each one twice, and went in for the night. Winter in Montana does not ask permission. It arrived that year in full force the last week of November, a storm that came down from the Canadian plain with the particular indifference of something that had never concerned itself with what was in its path. The temperature dropped to places the thermometer, outside Eliza's barn door, barely had numbers for. The wind came in sideways. Snow fell in the kind of volume that changed the geometry of everything. Fence lines disappeared. The road from the property to Denton became theoretical, and the world contracted to the immediate, the here, the what is directly in front of you. Eliza had prepared. She had been preparing since October, since the investment from Agnes had come through, and she had been able to buy the feed and weatherproof the barn structures properly, and lay in the supplies that 4 previous winters had taught her she would need. She was not caught unguarded. But preparation and the actual arrival of a Montana winter were still different things, and the first 3 days of the storm reminded her of that with the blunt thoroughness the frontier always used for its reminders. The horses consumed her time from before dawn until after dark. The Beaumont animals, even Clara, even Decker, who had come so far, were unsettled by the storm in ways that required constant management. Not crisis-level unsettled, but the kind of heightened anxiety that, left unattended, could compound into something harder to address. She moved through the barn in a continuous loop, checking water that threatened to freeze, despite the insulation she'd packed around the troughs, managing the feed distribution so the more dominant animals didn't crowd out the others, watching for the physical signs that distinguished weather stress from something medical. Thomas had been unable to come since the storm began. The road was genuinely impassable. She had known this was possible and had accepted it as a condition of winter ranch work, which didn't make the extra labor easier, but at least made it unsurprising. On the 3rd day, Dale Sutton appeared. She heard his horse before she saw him, which was the only warning the storm allowed. He came through the white with the deliberate pace of a man who had been doing difficult things in difficult weather for a very long time and had no performance left in him about it. He had a pack on his saddle. She met him at the barn door. "You shouldn't have come out in this." "Probably not," he said, without particular concern. He handed her the pack. "Feed supplement. My operation uses it for the cold months. Figured you might not have laid it in." He dismounted stiffly, his knees, she remembered. "Mind if I warm up before I head back? Come in." She made coffee on the small stove she kept in the barn for exactly these conditions, and they sat on upturned crates while Sutton thawed out, and she checked on the horses in the intervals between warming her own hands on her cup. "Bad one," Sutton said, meaning the storm. "Bad one," she agreed. "There's 3 ranches between here and Denton that have horses out in the open." He said it without inflection, the way you stated a fact that had its own implications built in. She looked at him. "Which 3?" he told her. 2 of them she knew small operations, the kind that ran on thin margins and sometimes made decisions about barn space based on what was cheapest rather than what was safest. The 3rd was a name she didn't recognize, which meant it was probably a newer claim, someone who hadn't been through a winter like this one yet. "How many horses?" she said. "Between the 3 of them?" 20, maybe more. "In this temperature, with no shelter." He stopped. He didn't need to finish the sentence. They both knew what happened to horses in open fields in this kind of cold. It happened fast, and it was not peaceful, and it was the kind of thing that stayed with you. Eliza looked out the barn door at the white, nothing of the storm. She thought about her feed supply, which was adequate for her own animals, and not much beyond that. She thought about her barn space, which was full. She thought about the Beaumont horses, who were managing the current situation, but who she knew well enough to understand that adding 20 unknown animals to their environment in the middle of a crisis was exactly the kind of destabilizing. variable she had spent months learning how to avoid. She thought about 20 horses in open fields. I have the western section fence, she said. The windbreak from the ridge. It's not a barn, but it's real shelter. Sutton looked at her steadily. You'd need to break a trail to get them here. I know, your road's under 3 feet of drift. I know that too. He was quiet for a moment. Then he set down his coffee cup. My foreman has a plow rig. It's not fast, but it moves snow. She looked at him. Dale, I know, he said. I know what I'm offering. I want to be clear that I know. He picked his hat up from where he'd set it. You want to try this? I'll send for the rig. She stood up. Send for the rig. What happened in the next 18 hours was not heroic, in the way that things get called heroic afterward, when the story gets cleaned up and the difficult parts get compressed into something manageable. It was cold and slow and exhausting, and at several points genuinely uncertain in ways that did not resolve neatly. Sutton's plow rig, operated by his foreman, a laconic man named Rourke, who communicated primarily through the angle of his hat brim, broke a path from Eliza's property out to the main road and then to each of the 3 ranches in sequence. It took 4 hours just for the road work. Eliza rode behind the rig, which was the kind of cold that got into places she hadn't known cold could reach. The first ranch was a man named Betts, who came to the door with the stunned expression of someone who had not yet fully understood what the storm was doing to his animals. He had 7 horses in his south field. 2 of them were already in bad condition, standing with their backs to the wind, heads down, the particular stillness that meant they were past agitation and into something more dangerous. She worked fast. She and Rourke and Betts moved the horses, the 5, that could be moved without special handling onto the trail back toward her property. The 2 in bad condition required more work. She spent 40 minutes with each of them, warming what she could warm with limited resources, assessing, making hard calls about what was possible. She got both of them moving. It was not a guarantee. It was just movement, which was what she had and what she offered. The second ranch was empty. The family had left. She learned later they'd gone to relatives in Denton when the storm hit, which was probably the right decision for the family and a terrible one for the 12 horses they'd left in their back pasture. She found the horses in a cluster against the fence line, using each other's body heat in the practical, instinctive way animals do when they're trying to stay alive. Getting 12 unfamiliar horses moving in a storm toward a destination they didn't know, managed by people they had no relationship with, was exactly as difficult as it sounds. Rourke was good with horses in the straightforward way of experienced ranch hands. Eliza was good with them in her particular way. Between the 2 of them, with Sutton working the back of the group, they got the horses moving. Twice the group nearly scattered. Once when a gust hit from a direction the wind hadn't been coming from, which startled the whole group into a collective surge that took 10 minutes to settle. Once when one of the Betts horses stumbled on the ice trail and went down and the sound of it ran through the others like a current. She got the fallen horse up. It cost time she didn't have and energy she was running short on, and she was not entirely sure, in the dark and the cold with her hands barely functional inside her gloves, that she was making the right call every step of the way. She was making calls, and she was making them as well as she could with what she knew and what she had, and that was what the situation allowed. They reached her property as the sky was beginning to lighten toward a gray that might eventually become morning. She had the western section open the fence gate that she'd repaired in the fall, the windbreak from the ridge that she'd been right about for 4 years running. She put the outside horses there, all of them she'd brought, with feed and what wind protection the section offered. They clustered instinctively near the ridge, which was exactly what the ridge was there for. The 2 from Betts that had been in bad condition she put in the barn, in temporary spaces she created by rearranging the Beaumont horses with more efficiency than gentleness, and hoping the disruption wouldn't cost her weeks of trust building. Decker objected strenuously to the rearrangement. She talked him through it in the exhausted shorthand they'd developed, which was less elegant than her usual work, and apparently sufficient. She didn't get to the 3rd ranch. By the time they'd finished at the property, it was mid-morning, and the storm was, if anything, worse than it had been. Rourke told her the 3rd ranch, the one she didn't know, was another 2 miles east, and the road in that direction was in worse shape than the one they'd already broken. She stood in her barn doorway and made the calculation that she had been making calculations all night. What was possible? What was safe? What could be lost and what couldn't? Who owns it, she said. Filed last spring, Rourke said. Name of web young couple, I think. She thought about it. The road. Her own animals who needed attention. The condition she was in, which was honest, she was running on the residue of the night and would become a liability rather than a resource if she pushed past it recklessly. Get me to the telegraph in Denton, if the road's open that way, she said. I'll send to the sheriff's office. They have a winter response crew. Rourke nodded. That was the right call, and they both knew it, which didn't make it comfortable. She sent the telegram. The response crew reached the Webb Ranch by early afternoon. The horses there, 6 of them were in poor condition, but alive when they arrived. She learned this 2 days later, when the storm had broken enough for news to travel. She sat with that number for a while. All of them alive. Not because of anything clean or perfect, because of the plow rig and Sutton's foreman, and the western section's windbreak, and the telegram, and the sheriff's crew, and 20 other things that had had to work in sequence. But alive. The story moved through the county faster than she expected. She had not intended it to be a story. She had intended it to be a problem with horses in the cold that needed solving, which she and Sutton and Rourke had then solved with varying degrees of success. But the frontier had its own information systems, and by the time the storm fully cleared and the roads opened, the shape of what had happened had already assembled itself into something people were passing between them at feed stores and telegraph offices and front porches. Betts came by himself on the first clear day, with his hat in his hand. He was a man in his 60s, weathered in the way of men who had worked land their whole lives, with the uncomfortable expression of someone who owed something and was not accustomed to owing. Lost 2 animals over the winter before, he said. Both times I thought, well, thought it was just what happens. He turned his hat. Your place was the reason I've still got 7. Dale Sutton's rig is the reason you've still got 7, she said. And Rourke. Rourke told me who organized it. She didn't have an easy answer to that, so she didn't try for one. Your horses are in the west section. 2 still in the barn. When the ground firms up, you can come collect them. He came most days for the next week to check on his animals, and she noticed that when he came, he worked fixing things that needed fixing, helping Thomas with the water hauling, doing the practical fence work that there was always more of than time to do. He didn't announce this as payment. He just did it, which she found she respected. The family from the second ranch, she learned their name, was Fender came back from Denton when the roads opened and found their 12 horses at Eliza's property, alive and fed and in better condition than they'd had any right to expect. Mrs. Fender, a woman in her 40s, with the particular emotional directness of someone who had been worrying for a week, cried at the gate, in a way that Eliza found difficult to watch, not because it was excessive, but because she understood the specific quality of that relief. The relief that comes when you find out the worst thing you were afraid of didn't happen. We didn't know, Mrs. Fender said, wiping her face with her sleeve. We didn't know if we'd made the right call leaving them. You made the call you had to make, Eliza said. The horses are fine. She helped the Fenders load their 12 horses over the course of a morning, which was logistically interesting, because some of the Fender horses had, after a week in the western section, with Eliza's approach running constantly in the background, she had been managing the whole group with the same method she used on the Beaumont animals, because it was the only approach she had become noticeably easier to handle than they apparently had been before. Mr. Fender noticed. He was a quiet man who watched things, and he watched his horses loading with an expression that shifted during the process. They're different, he said. Storm does things to animals, she said. Which was true and not the whole truth. It's not the storm, he said. He looked at her directly. What did you do? She thought about how to answer that. The same thing I do with all of them, she said finally. Paid attention to what they were telling me. He thought about that for a moment. Then he nodded, the slow nod of a man absorbing something that's going to take time to fully process. Pruitt came by on a Wednesday in early December. She had not expected him personally. She had expected, maybe, another letter from his lawyers, or another ambiguous gesture like the foreman through the fence line, something at the edge of accountability. She had not expected him to ride up to her gate and dismount and take his hat off. She was at the barn when he came. She kept working for a moment, the same thing she'd done when he'd visited before, the continuous work approach, and then she set down what she was doing and walked out to meet him, because, whatever this was, She wanted to meet it in the open. He looked older than the last time she'd seen him. That was her first thought, and she recognized it was the kind of thought you had when you'd spent a long time in conflict with someone, and then saw them as a person again. He was still a big man, still carried that settled into the space quality. But something about his posture was different. "Miss Whitmore," he said. "Mr. Pruitt." He looked at the western section, where the combined group of horses, hers, and the remaining Bettet's animals was visible in the pale December light. He looked at the barn. He looked at the fence work that had been done in the last month, which was considerably more extensive than what had existed in October. "I heard about what you did in the storm," he said. She waited. "Betts is my neighbor since 1882, he said. "I've known the Fender family since they came out here. The Webb boy's father worked for me for 6 years. He turned his hat in his hands. The hat-turning thing," she noted, seemed to be a universal habit among men of the frontier. "Kept their animals alive. Dale Sutton's rig kept their animals alive," she said. "Rourke, the sheriff's crew. You organized it." He said it flatly, without apparent agenda. "In the middle of a blizzard, with your own property to manage and your own animals at risk, you organized a rescue for horses that weren't yours." She didn't answer because he wasn't asking a question. He was quiet for a moment. He looked out at the western section again. "I'm dropping the water rights inquiry," he said. "Bream's office will receive notice this week." She kept her face exactly where she had it. "I've also spoken to my lawyer about the ongoing pressure campaign," he said. The phrase pressure campaign came out of his mouth with the bluntness of a man naming a thing he'd been thinking about naming for a while. "It'll stop." "What changed?" she said. He was quiet for long enough that she thought he wasn't going to answer. Then he said, "I've been in this county a long time. I've seen people come out here with plans and leave with nothing. I've seen it enough that I started to think it was inevitable. The land sorted people out." He paused. "I was wrong about you." "You were wrong about the land," she said. "Not just about me." He looked at her. "You looked at this property and saw what wasn't there," she said. "The same way everyone did. The same way my husband did. The land isn't worthless. It never was. It just required someone willing to understand it on its own terms." He held her gaze. She held his. It was not a comfortable moment. It had too much history in it for comfort, but it was an honest one. "Fair," he said. He put his hat back on. He started to remount, then stopped. He looked at her over his horse's back. "The Beaumont horses," he said. "I was going to have them put down, I know. I thought they were beyond anything useful. I know that too." He mounted up. He didn't say anything else. He rode back down her road and onto the main track toward his own operation, and she stood at the gate and watched until he was out of sight. Then she went back to the barn. Thomas was inside, having apparently witnessed the whole exchange from the barn door. He had his journal open and his pencil in his hand. She looked at him. "Write it down," she said. He was already writing. "Agnes came in January, the 3rd week, when the worst of the winter had settled into the gray, grinding middle section that was less dramatic than the storms, but harder in its sustained demands. She came with Miriam and with a man Eliza hadn't met introduced as Holbrook, who ran Agnes's financial arrangements and had a face made for numbers, precise, patient, giving nothing away without intention. They sat at Eliza's kitchen table, the same table where the deed had landed on the floor 14 months ago, and went through the program in detail. What had been built, what it had produced, what the plan was for spring, and what would be needed to execute it. Agnes had brought updated terms for their arrangement, which she laid out with the same directness she brought to everything. Eliza read them carefully, asked the questions she needed to ask, pushed back on 2 points, and got movement on one of them. The other was a genuine disagreement about timeline that they negotiated to something both of them could accept, which took 40 minutes and left neither of them entirely satisfied, which Eliza had found was the signature of a fair deal. Holbrook took notes in a very small, precise handwriting that she found obscurely impressive. After the business, Agnes walked the western section with her, both of them in their heaviest coats against the January cold. The horses were there, all of them now, hers and the remaining Betts animals, which Betts had asked her to keep through the winter on a care arrangement that suited them both. "You'll breed in spring," Agnes said. "Clara's ready," Eliza said. "Rue's close." She thought about how to describe it. "Decker is going to be something. I'm not rushing him." "No," Agnes said. She was watching Decker, who was watching them back from the middle of the group. Don't rush him. They stood in the cold for a moment. Pruitt came, Eliza said. Agnes looked at her herd. You heard quickly. I have a particular network of information, Agnes said, which was all she offered on the subject. What did you think of it? Eliza considered the question honestly. I think he meant it. I think he's a man who responds to evidence, and the storm was evidence he couldn't dismiss. She paused. I don't think it means he's become a different person. I think it means the pressure from that direction has moved to something more manageable. And you trust manageable? More than I trust resolved, she said. Resolved is usually a story someone is telling. Manageable is something you can actually work with. Agnes made a sound that was as close to a laugh as she seemed to come in daylight. You have a very unsentimental way of thinking about people. I've had good reasons to develop it, Eliza said. It was in February that Caleb came back. She had known in the abstract that it was possible. Men who left the way Caleb left, without completing anything, without resolution, often came back. Not always, but often enough that she had kept the possibility somewhere in her thinking, a variable she hadn't dismissed. But knowing something is possible and being prepared for it are different things. And when she heard his voice in the yard on a gray February morning, she was not prepared. She was in the middle of working with Decker, which was the most sustained concentration she did in a given day, and her first response to recognizing the voice was a physical one, a tightening somewhere in her chest that she did not want and could not entirely control. She finished what she was doing with Decker first. It took 6 minutes. She was aware that this was also a choice not coming immediately, not dropping everything at the sound of his voice. She finished the session properly, transitioned Decker out correctly, and then walked out to the yard. He was standing at the gate. He looked like himself, which was both obvious and strange. 18 months since she'd seen him. He had his hat in his hand, of course he did, and he was looking at the property with an expression she couldn't read at the distance. And then he saw her coming, and the expression changed to something she recognized better. Though recognition was not the same as welcome. Eliza, he said, Caleb. He looked at the western section, at the horses, at the barn that had been weatherproofed, and the fence lines that had been repaired, and the things that existed on this property now that had not existed when he left. You did it, he said. There was something in his voice she had not expected, not apology, not quite, but something near enough that it was uncomfortable. I did, she said. The whole county is talking about what you did in the storm. The whole county talks about everything, she said. Come in if you want to talk. I have work to finish by dark. She turned and walked back toward the barn. She heard him follow, heard the gate close behind him, and she did not stop walking. He sat at the kitchen table while she made coffee, and she watched him look around the kitchen at the tin box on the shelf, at the notes stacked near the window that documented 18 months of work, at the things that said someone had been living and working in this space with focus and intention. The Billings work didn't last, he said. I assumed it didn't, she said. She put the coffee in front of him. She did not sit down immediately. I've been working for a freighting operation out of Bozeman since spring, he said. It's work. He stopped. He wrapped his hands around the cup. It's not what I wanted. What did you want? She said. She sat down across from him. He looked at her. There was something genuinely painful in his face, which she registered without letting it move her in the direction of too much sympathy, because sympathy and wisdom were not the same thing, and she had been confusing them for most of her marriage. I wanted this, he said. Something like this, something that was yours, she said. Yes, and when it got hard, you left. The words came out flat, not cruel, just accurate. He flinched a little anyway. I know that, and you came back because you heard it worked out. She looked at him steadily, which is not the same thing as coming back because you want to help build something. He was quiet for a long moment. I know that too, he said. I'm not asking to. He stopped again. He seemed to be having difficulty with sentences, which was unusual. Caleb had always been a fluent man. I don't know what I'm asking. Then I'd think about it before you ask it, she said. She got up and went back to the barn. She had work to do. She had always had work to do, and the work had never stopped for anything yet, and it was not going to stop now. He was still at the table when she came back an hour later. He had made a second cup of coffee and was sitting with it and had the expression of a man who had been thinking hard about something and had not found a comfortable ending to the thought. The land, he said. I called it worthless. You did. I was wrong. You were, she said. He looked at his cup. Is there anything here for me to do? I'm not asking for what was. I'm asking if there's work. If I can be useful. She thought about it. She thought about it longer than was comfortable for either of them. She thought about everything the property had required over the past 18 months and what it was going to require. Going forward, the breeding program, the expansion, continued management of relationships with Agnes and the buyers and the neighbors and Bream's ongoing work. She thought about Thomas, who was good and young and learning and not sufficient for everything alone. She thought about Caleb. Not the Caleb who had thrown the deed on the floor. Not the Caleb she had been angry at in the dark private hours of bad nights. The Caleb who was sitting across from her, older than he'd been, with something knocked out of him that she wasn't sure was entirely a bad thing to have knocked out. There's work, she said. There's always work. But I run this operation. You work in it. If that's not something you can do, then this conversation is finished. He looked at her. She met his eyes and held them. I can do that, he said. I mean it, Caleb. Not in theory. Not until something else comes along. I mean it too, he said, and his voice this time had something in it that she recognized as what sincere sounded like when a person wasn't performing it. She poured herself a cup of coffee and sat back down. The horse is in the western section, she said. The gray one she's named Clara. She's the furthest along in the program, and she's sensitive to new people. You don't approach her without me present. Not for a month, at least. He nodded. Decker the bay stallion, he'll test you. He tests everyone. You don't push back. You hold your ground, but you don't push. All right. Thomas comes Tuesdays and Thursdays, and sometimes in between. He knows the program. He knows the horses. You listen to him. Caleb's expression shifted slightly at the idea of listening to a 17-year-old boy, but he absorbed it. All right, he said again. She looked at him for a moment longer. At the man she had married, sitting at the table he had left, in the property he had called worthless. Complicated truth that people were not simply their worst moments, even when their worst moments had been genuinely bad. You should know, she said, that this isn't what you left. It's something else. Something I built. She said it without heat, without triumph, just as the fact it was. You're welcome to be part of what I'm building going forward, but you're not getting back the thing you abandoned. That's gone. Caleb looked at his cup. I know that, he said quietly. I know exactly what I let go. Outside, the February cold held the plains in its gray grip, and somewhere in the western section, Decker was doing what he did watching, assessing, deciding what to trust. The same intelligence in a different body, the same patient work of figuring out who was worth opening toward. She drank her coffee and looked out the window at the land that had always been worth more than anyone had seen in it. Spring was 6 weeks away. There was work to do before it got there. Spring came the way it always came to Montana, not gently, not as any kind of gift, but as a negotiation. The snow pulled back in stages, revealing the ground underneath in patches, and the ground underneath was soft and dark, and full of what it had been holding through the cold months. Creek on the north section ran again, clear and cold, carrying the winter's melt toward the low places. The grasses in the western section came in early, the way they always did, because the western section had always known something that the rest of the property was still learning. Eliza stood at the fence of the western section on the first genuinely warm morning of March and let herself feel it, the particular loosening that came with the end of a hard winter. Not relief exactly. Something more complicated than relief. The acknowledgement that you had come through something, and that coming through something was not the same as having it behind you, because the next thing was already waiting. Clara was in the western section, moving through the new grass with the unhurried, good attention of a horse, who had learned that good things were available, and there was no need to rush toward them, or away from anything. She was 3 months from foaling. Pregnancy had been managed carefully. Agnes's network had provided a veterinarian from Billings who came out twice and confirmed what Eliza had already known from watching the mare closely, that Clara was carrying well, that the foal's position was correct, that everything was developing the way it should. Eliza had not told anyone how much she was holding her breath about it. Decker stood at the far end of the section, watching Clara with the particular attention he brought to her specifically. The relationship between them, the two Beaumont animals who had come the furthest, who had been the most damaged and the most transformed, had developed to something Eliza found difficult to describe to anyone who hadn't watched it happen. Not affection in any simple sense. Something more like mutual recognition. Two animals who understood, in whatever way horses understood things, that they had come from the same broken place and arrived somewhere different. She heard Caleb behind her before she saw him. 2 months into his return, and she had not yet recalibrated to his presence, kept catching herself expecting to be alone, and finding him instead, which produced a sensation she had not named because naming it would require knowing what it was. He was carrying 2 cups of coffee, which was something he had started doing in the second week, without being asked. He handed her one and stood at the fence beside her, without speaking, looking at the horses. This was the thing that had surprised her most about Caleb's return. He had come back quieter than he'd left. The fluency was still there, the ease, with words when he chose to use them, but he used them less. He watched more. He worked with a steadiness that had not been present in the early years of the property, when his ambition had been loud and his patience thin. Something had changed in him, in Billings, in whatever the opportunity had turned out to be. And she was still deciding how much weight to give that change. "Clara looks good," he said. "She does," Eliza agreed. "Foal will be something." "Yes." She drank her coffee. "Thomas is coming today. I want you to work with him on the eastern section fence. The north corner it needs to be done before we think about putting any animals over there." "I'll do it." He paused. "Decker let me stand inside the fence line yesterday." She looked at him. "I know. I was watching." He absorbed that without visible reaction. "You were watching from where?" "The barn door." He was quiet for a moment. "You didn't tell me. I wanted to see what you'd do without supervision." "And you did the right thing," she said. "Didn't push. Held your ground when he tested. Kept your attention on him without making it a confrontation." She looked back at Decker. "He'll come further. It'll take time." "I've got time," Caleb said. She heard the weight in it, not a claim about the ranch, not anything that asked for a response. Just a man saying a true thing about where he was. She let it stand. The foal arrived on the 14th of April in the early morning, and nothing about it was clean or easy or certain until suddenly it was. Eliza's had been sleeping in the barn for the last 2 weeks, on a bedroll near Clara's stall, waking at every sound and then settling back when it was nothing. She had attended enough foalings to know that knowing what you were doing did not remove the animal terror of the thing, the sudden nature of it, the way the margins between fine and not fine could be measured in minutes. Clara foaled at 4 in the morning, and Eliza was awake when it started, and she stayed at the edge of the stall's presence, close enough to intervene if needed, far enough that Clara had the space to do what she was doing without feeling managed. This was the final application of everything she had learned, knowing when to be present, and when presence itself was the interference. The foal was on the ground by 4:40, a filly. Dark, like Decker, with Clara's particular quality of attention already visible in the way she lifted her head and registered the world. She was, Eliza thought, sitting on the barn floor, with her back against the stall boards, and her heart doing things that had no medical name. Possibly the most complete argument for everything she had believed about this land and these horses and what they could produce together. She did not cry. She wanted the record to show that she did not cry. Her face was wet, but that was a different thing entirely, and she was prepared to defend that position indefinitely. She named the filly Meridian. She wrote the name in Thomas's journal and then in her own, and she sat with Clara and Meridian in the pre-dawn dark for an hour before she went inside and made the first of the letters she needed to write. The letter to Agnes was factual and detailed foaling time, filly's condition, confirmation of health, projected timeline for the next phase of the breeding program. She wrote it in the precise language of a person conducting a program, which she was, and then she sat for a moment before sealing it and wrote one sentence at the end that was not precise and not about the program. "She is extraordinary." Agnes would understand what that meant from her, coming from someone who was not in the habit of extraordinary. The letter to Foster and Crane and Helena was also waiting. She had been corresponding with them since the exhibition in September, careful, measured correspondence that had moved through several rounds of what she understood to be mutual assessment. They wanted to understand what she was building before committing to a purchasing relationship. She had wanted to understand their network and their standards before agreeing to supply it. The correspondence had been, she thought, productive in the specific way that productive meant, slow and unglamorous and building towards something real. She wrote to them about Meridian, about the program's first result, about what she expected the filly to demonstrate as she developed, and what the breeding program was designed to produce going forward. She wrote with the confidence of someone who has done the work and knows what the work has earned, which was a different quality of confidence than she'd had even 6 months ago. She sealed both letters and set them on the table. Then she went back to the barn because Clara needed her morning routine and Meridian needed to be watched, and the work did not stop for milestones any more than it stopped for storms. The response from Agnes came 10 days later, and it contained 2 things. The first was Agnes's own assessment of the foal, based on Eliza's letter, confirmed that the breeding match had produced the specific combination of qualities. Agnes's network of buyers was looking for the particular intelligence that came from Clara's line, combined with the physical soundness of Decker's. Agnes outlined 3 buyers she was in contact with who had expressed interest in horses from this program even before Meridian's birth, and she suggested that when the filly was old enough to demonstrate her training responsiveness, a private showing might be arranged. The second thing was a forwarded letter. It had come to Agnes first, which suggested the sender had known. Agnes was connected to Eliza's operation. It was from a woman named Dr. Ruth Fenwick, who was associated with a livestock research institution in Denver. She had heard through a network of connections that the letter traced in a way that made Eliza's head light about the methods being used on the Whitmore property. She was interested in corresponding. She was specifically interested in the documented results with the Beaumont horses and what those results suggested about approaches to equine behavioral rehabilitation. Eliza read the letter 3 times. She had not told anyone, when she started keeping Thomas's journal and her own parallel notes, that she thought what she was building might be something beyond a ranch. She had not said it because saying it out loud would have made it the kind of claim that needed defending before she had enough evidence to defend it. And she had seen what happened when people made claims they couldn't back, yet they became performances of ambition rather than things actually being built. But she had thought it. She had been thinking it quietly and consistently for over a year. She wrote back to Dr. Fenwick that evening. She enclosed a summary of the documentation, not the full notes. Those needed organizing before she showed them to anyone with a research background. And she asked the questions she needed to ask about what the institution did and what correspondence with them would look like and what they were actually interested in. She sealed the letter. Caleb was in the kitchen when she finished, eating at the table with the particular quiet of a man who had learned that evenings were working time and not conversation time unless she initiated it. There's a research institution in Denver that's interested in the training methods, she said. He looked up. He processed this in a way she recognized. The old Caleb would have made it large immediately, would have turned it into a statement about what it meant and where it led. This Caleb looked at her steadily. What does that mean? I don't know yet, she said. I'm going to find out. All right, he said. She sat down and ate, and they were quiet together in the way they had learned to be quiet, which was not the silence of things unsaid, but the silence of people who had run out of performance and found something more sustainable underneath it. Thomas turned 18 in May, and Eliza gave him the journal. Not the original, she kept that, because it was the foundation of the documentation. But she had been through the winter, transcribing the notes into a clean copy that organized the observations by horse and by method, and by outcome. She gave him that copy, with a letter she had written in the evenings over the course of 2 weeks. Supson. The letter said, among other things, that he had been the most important person in the building of this program for the last year, and that she intended to formalize his role in it going forward. That she would pay him properly, not the arrangement they'd had while he was Nora's boy, doing her a favor. That she expected him to continue documenting and to begin taking on direct training work with the horses that were further along, under her supervision, and then independently. It also said, and this was the part she had rewritten 4 times, that what he had been doing for the past year was the beginning of a career, and he should understand it as such. That the frontier had a way of making people feel that what they did was just what needed doing, not something with a name or a value attached. She wanted him to know that what he did had both. He read the letter in the barn, sitting on an overturned crate, and she busied herself with other things so he could read it without being watched. When he was done, he folded it carefully and put it inside the journal cover. "I'm not going anywhere," he said, without preamble. "Good," she said. "I mean, even if something else came up. I'm not going." She looked at him. He was 18 and tall and still growing into himself, and she saw, in the straightness of how he said it, that it was a statement about loyalty made by someone who understood what the word meant. Not sentiment, commitment. "Good," she said again with a different weight. June brought Foster and Crane. They came in person, which was not what she had expected from the correspondence. She had anticipated another exchange of letters, more time, more careful mutual assessment. Instead, they sent a telegram and arrived 3 days later in a wagon that was considerably better than anything she owned, with a third man she hadn't met who was introduced as a buyer named Aldrich from Chicago. Chicago. She absorbed that. She showed them the western section, the horses, the records. Thomas walked them through the documentation with a precision that Eliza watched with something close to pride, which she kept to herself. Aldrich, a man in his 40s, with the particular attention of someone accustomed to evaluating things quickly, and expensive, watched Meridian with an expression that showed nothing and communicated everything. Clara moved through the western section with the filly close, and Eliza watched Aldrich watch them. She had learned to read the quality of attention buyers brought to animals. There was a kind of attention that was calculating the number, and a different kind that was registering what was actually there. Aldrich was doing both, in that sequence, which told her something about how serious this was. "The documentation is unusual," he said to Eliza specifically. "The program is unusual," she said. "Systematic behavioral records going back to acquisition." He had the file Thomas had prepared, and he was not skimming it. "This is closer to what research institutions do than what ranches do." "I'm aware," she said. She thought of Dr. Fenwick's letter still in correspondence. "The documentation exists because the method requires it. You can't make the adjustments the program requires without knowing what you've already tried and what the animal has told you about it." Aldrich looked at her. "How many horses can the program produce per year at full capacity?" She had done this math from multiple angles, 8 to 12, at the level I'm prepared to stand behind. More than that, and the quality of attention drops, which defeats the program's purpose. 8 to 12 is not a large number. "No," she agreed. "It isn't," which is what they're worth. Foster made a small sound that was almost suppressed. Crane was looking at the fence line with the careful attention of a man who had just heard a negotiating position stated cleanly and was absorbing it. Aldrich looked at her for a long moment. "What are you asking for, Meridian?" She had thought about this number for a long time. She had thought about what it would mean to set it too low, the way that setting a number too low communicated something about how you valued your own work that could not be easily revised upward later. She had thought about what it would mean to set it too high, the difference between confidence and performance. Told him the number. The yard was quiet for a moment. Foster looked at Crane. Crane's expression shifted and settled. Aldrich nodded. "I'll need to see her in a working demonstration before we conclude anything." "Of course," Eliza said, "when you're ready." The demonstration happened the following morning. Thomas worked with Meridian. She was barely 2 months old. It was not a formal training demonstration, but a showing of temperament, of the quality of attention, of the inheritance of Clara's particular intelligence. And Eliza stood at the fence with the 3 men and watched and did not say anything, because the work spoke for itself, or it didn't. It spoke for itself. Aldrich made his decision before noon. Terms took 2 hours to negotiate, and at the end of those 2 hours, they had an agreement that was, by any measurement Eliza applied, extraordinary. Not just for Meridian, though the figure for Meridian was more than she had allowed herself to hope for. The agreement included a forward purchasing arrangement, first right of refusal on horses, from the program over the next 3 years, at rates tied to demonstrated quality, with provisions she had insisted on that protected the program's integrity and her operational independence. Foster and Crane had brought a lawyer in the wagon, which she should have expected and hadn't. She had Bream on a letter, and she sent Thomas with it, while she kept the meeting going, and Bream's response came back by mid-afternoon, a telegram, not a letter, because Thomas had understood the urgency. The telegram said, "Terms look sound. One clause on the quality provisions needs language tightened. Specific change enclosed. She made the change. Aldrich's lawyer reviewed it. They signed. She shook Aldrich's hand in her own yard in the June sun on the 20 acres that Caleb had called a graveyard of dirt and broken dreams. Caleb was at the east fence the whole time, working on the repairs she'd asked him to complete, not attending the meeting, not inserting himself. She had not asked him to stay away. He had simply understood it, which was perhaps the most significant evidence of the change in him, knowing what was hers and not reaching for it. That evening, after Foster and Crane and Aldrich had driven back toward Denton, and the road was empty again, she walked the entire property. She did this sometimes, not often, but when something had happened that needed to be held against the actual ground to understand its weight. She started at the north section, where the creek was running clearly in the June evening, and she walked the fence lines in sequence, all of them. The ones that were solid, and the ones that still needed work, and the one on the east corner that Caleb had finished that afternoon. She ended in the western section, because she always ended in the western section. Clara was there with Meridian. The filly had grown in the 2 months since birth, in the fast, visible way of young horses, already showing the long lines that suggested what she would be. She was watching Eliza, with the same quality of attention Clara had always shown, whole body, present, engaged with what was actually there rather than what might be threatening. Eliza stood in the western section in the evening light and thought about the woman who had stood here 4 years ago and seen something that nobody else had seen. She thought about what it had cost to hold that vision. Not in the abstract way that people talk about cost when what they mean is effort. The real cost, the accumulated weight of being wrong sometimes, of making mistakes that mattered, of pushing through nights when the honest assessment of her situation was that it might not work. The cost of watching a man she had trusted throw the deed on the floor. The cost of maintaining focus when every external signal said she should relinquish it. She had not been right about everything. She wanted to be clear about that in her own mind, because clean narratives were a form of dishonesty she had no patience for. She had made poor calls about the feed supply in the first summer. She had misjudged the timeline on 2 of the Beaumont horses and pushed faster than she should have, and had to walk things back carefully. She had almost missed Pruitt's water rights gambit because she had been focused on the horses and not on the legal landscape. She had taken too long to ask Agnes for help, held out from pride when partnership was the smarter tool. She had been wrong about things. She had also been right about the things that mattered most: the land, the horses, and the method. She thought about the people who had made it possible. Nora, who had sent Thomas the morning the news needed delivering by someone friendly. Thomas himself, who had spent a year turning his presence into something she depended on in ways she hadn't entirely anticipated. Dale Sutton, who had shown up in a blizzard with feed supplement and offered his rig without making it into anything larger than what it was. Wallace Bream, who had fought her legal battles with quiet competence and a minimum of drama. Agnes Colworth, who had written 3 weeks after receiving a letter from a stranger because she recognized something in the writing that was worth recognizing. Even Pruitt. She held him for a moment because the honest accounting required it. Pruitt had been the pressure that forced her to be better prepared, better documented, more legally sound than she might have been without an adversary. She did not thank him for that. She was not interested in converting her enemies into her teachers in that particular way that made hardship sound instructive rather than genuinely hard. But she held it. The pressure had been real, and so had her response to it. And Caleb. She sat down on the grass of the western section, which was something she rarely did, and which Clara immediately registered by moving toward her with the investigative attention of a horse who has found her human doing something unusual. Eliza put her hand out and let Clara's nose find it, and sat with the warm weight of the mare's breath on her palm. Caleb was more complicated than the others. He had left and come back, which were both facts. He had called the land worthless and been wrong, which was a fact. He had been working for 4 months, with a steadiness and a quietness that she had not expected from him, which was also a fact. He had not asked to be restored to anything, not to partnership, not to the position he would have had if he'd stayed, not to anything that preceded his decision to leave. He was simply here, doing the work. She did not know what to do with that. She did not know if there was a word for what they were to each other in this configuration. or if the frontier's general indifference to precise categories of relationship was actually more honest than the categories themselves. He was a person who had done something she would not forget and could not entirely forgive, and who was also a person doing the work right now, in front of her, every day, kept him at the distance his actions had created. She also did not send him away. Maybe that was enough of an answer for the moment. Maybe the moment was all she needed to decide. The letter from Dr. Fenwick, when the full response came, changed things in a way she had not entirely predicted. Dr. Fenwick was not interested in observing. She was interested in documentation in the systematic records that Thomas had been keeping and that Eliza had been organizing since the previous winter. She was interested in whether the method could be described in terms specific enough to be communicated to other practitioners. She was interested, in short, in whether what Eliza had been doing was a repeatable thing or a gift specific to one person. That question hit something in Eliza that she hadn't known was there until it was touched. She sat with it for 3 days, because the honest answer was that she didn't fully know. She had developed the method through accumulated observation and adjustment, the way you developed any skill that was primarily about paying attention. She had passed aspects of it to Thomas, and Thomas had taken to it, which suggested it was teachable. But teaching Thomas was different from writing it down in terms that a stranger in another place could apply without her present. She wrote back to Dr. Fenwick and told her this honestly. She said she was willing to attempt the documentation, and that the attempt itself would tell them both something about how transferable the method was. She said she needed 6 months, and she needed Thomas's help, and she needed to continue running the program while doing it, because she was not willing to stop the work in order to describe it. Dr. Fenwick wrote back in 2 weeks. She agreed to all 3 conditions. She sent, along with her letter, a modest research stipend. Eliza read that word twice for the documentation work. The amount was small by some measures. It was real by all of them. She told Thomas that evening, in the barn, during the routine that ended each working day. He was quiet for a moment. So we're writing a book. Not a book, she said. Documentation. What's the difference? She thought about it. A book is for people to read. A method is for people to use. She paused. Though I suppose if we do it right, it might eventually be both. He grinned. He was 18 and grinning in her barn about writing a method for equine behavioral rehabilitation, and she found that she was also quietly in the vicinity of a grin herself. Start tomorrow, he said. Start tonight, she said. Tell me what you would say about the first session with Decker. From your own notes, in your own words, in a way that someone who had never seen Decker and had never met me could follow. He pulled out the journal. He started talking. She listened and took notes, because that was how they worked. That had always been how they worked. And the barn was warm, and outside the Montana night was coming down, and in the western section, Clara and Meridian were moving through the last light together. By August, the documentation was 40 pages and growing. By August, the program had 2 additional foals from the mares in the Beaumont group, neither of them from Decker's line, but both showing the particular quality of attention that the program was built to produce. Agnes had visited twice more, and her buyer network had expanded to include 3 new names that Eliza did not know but was learning. The forward arrangement with Aldrich's people had produced 2 additional purchases, at figures that still required a moment of adjustment when she read them on paper. The eastern section was being worked. Not quickly, she refused to rush it, because rushing the land was the same mistake as rushing the horses. The imposition of your timeline on something that had its own. But the fence work was done, and the soil treatment she designed over the winter was in its first season and showing what it was going to show in another year. Bream wrote in July that Pruitt's legal inquiry had been formally withdrawn and the records at the county office had been updated accordingly. He included the confirmation document and a brief note, I have been practicing law in this county for 22 years. This is among the cleaner victories I have had occasion to record. Kept that note. She put it in the tin box with the deed and the original land survey, and Foster and Crane's first card, and the copied notation from Fitch's records. Tin box was getting full. She would need a larger box eventually, or a different system, which Thomas had been suggesting for months, and which she had been resisting on grounds that were probably more sentimental than practical. She told Thomas she would think about a different system. He wrote that down in the journal she was fairly certain. Caleb built the second barn. He started it in June, without being asked, came to her with a plan drawn on paper that was careful and specific and showed he had been thinking about the space requirements for the expanded program for some time without saying anything. She looked at the plan for a long time. "You drew this yourself," she said. "I've been looking at the space since March," he said, "thinking about what you'd need when the second full group arrives." She looked at the plan. It was good. It addressed things she had noted as problems, and some she hadn't fully articulated yet. The east wall orientation, she said. Move it 15 feet. The morning light will matter for the young horses. He made the adjustment on the drawing without comment. Sutton can get the lumber, she said. He's been using a mill in Denton that runs straight. I'll talk to him. She handed the plan back. He started on the foundation the following week. The work was slow and correct. She watched it from the periphery the way she watched everything, paying attention without directing, noting what he did and when he asked for help and from whom. He asked Betts's son for 2 weeks of assistance, which surprised her she hadn't known. He'd formed enough of a relationship with the Betts family to make that ask. Betts's son came, and the two of them worked together with the particular comfortable rhythm of men doing physical work who have sorted out their respective capabilities without making it a competition. The barn was framed by July and enclosed by August. It was not beautiful. It was solid and functional and exactly what the program needed. And the morning light came in the east windows the way she had said it would. She walked through it the first evening after the last wall went up, alone, while the August light was coming horizontal through those east windows and lying in long strips across the clean floor. She stood in the middle of the new barn and thought about the woman who had stood in the kitchen with the deed at her feet and made a decision in a silence that nobody else had been there to witness. She had not known that morning what she was deciding toward. She had known only what she was deciding against: the smallness of selling, the capitulation of letting someone else's assessment of the land become her assessment of herself. She had not had a plan fully formed. She had had stubbornness and the beginning of a method and 20 acres of ground that she was the only person who believed in. That had been enough to start. She had learned, and this was the thing she would write in the documentation. The thing that was not about horses, but was true of horses and true of people and true of land and true of any living thing that had been damaged and needed finding its way back, that the beginning did not need to be enough for the whole journey. The beginning only needed to be enough for the next step, and the next step only needed to be enough for the one after that. Certainty was not required. Certainty was a comfort that the frontier did not offer, and that she had stopped waiting for some time in that first summer when the well went dry and she had fixed it and kept going. What was required was attention. Sustained, specific, honest attention to what was actually there. Not what you wished was there, not what you feared was there, but what the evidence of careful observation produced. And the willingness to adjust when what you found was different from what you'd expected. And the willingness to hold your position when every external signal said you were wrong, and your internal assessment, built from evidence, said you were right. And sometimes other people, the ones who showed up in storms, the ones who sent letters back, the ones who sat on overturned crates and barns and wrote down what they saw with their whole careful attention. In the early evening of a day in late August, when the light was going gold the way it did at the end of summer, Eliza Whitmore walked out to the western section and stood at the fence. Meridian was there, 4 months old now, moving through the grass with the long-legged confidence of a young horse who has never been afraid of anything, because she had been born into a place where fear was not the operating condition. She had Clara's attention and Decker's bone and something else that was her own, a quality of presence that Eliza had not seen before in any horse, a kind of calm surety that seemed to come from some internal arrangement she had arrived with. Clara moved near her. Decker was at the far end of the section, where he always stood in the evenings watching. The other horses, Rue and Beck, and the younger ones, and the Betts animals that were now simply part of the operation in the way that things become part of a place when they stay, long enough, were distributed through the section in the easy patterns of animals that feel safe. Thomas came and stood beside her without being asked, which was how he always arrived now. "You should write down what this looks like," she said. He had his journal. He was already writing. Caleb came and stood on her other side, further back, at the distance he maintained not intrusive, not absent, simply present in the way he had learned to be present. She heard him behind her and did not turn. The light was going and the grass was moving, and Meridian was running for the pure reason of being young and fast and alive, because sometimes that was enough reason. Eliza had been thinking, these last weeks, about what Harlan Pruitt had said on his visit, that the land sorted people out, that he had watched people come and leave with nothing often enough to believe it was inevitable. She understood how you got to that belief. She understood the accumulation of disappointments that could harden into a conviction about what was possible. She had felt the pull of that conviction herself in the bad nights of the first winter, in the weeks after Caleb left, in every moment when the honest mathematics of her situation had been genuinely alarming. But she had looked at the same land. Pruitt had looked at and seen something different. Not because she was more capable than the people who had failed here. Not because she had been given advantages they hadn't. Because she had been willing to let the land teach her what it was, rather than deciding in advance what it was worth. That was the difference. It had always been the difference. The land did not sort people out. People sorted themselves by whether they were willing to look at what was actually there and work with it honestly. The ones who left had not been defeated by the land. They had been defeated by the distance between what they expected and what they found, and their unwillingness to close that distance through adjustment. She had been wrong about things too. She had expected more speed than the land offered, more straightforwardness than the horses offered, more clarity than any of it offered. She had just been willing stubbornly, sometimes furiously, occasionally with tears on her face in the dark of the barn, to close the distance anyway. Meridian ran the length of the western section and turned and ran it back. The 20 acres lay around her in the August evening, the creek running clean on the north, the eastern section showing the beginning of what it would be in another year, the new barn standing solid in the middle ground, the western section alive with horses that had come from impossible places and arrived at this. It was not finished. It was not clean. There was always more to do and more to learn, and more to get wrong and correct and try again. The documentation was 40 pages of a method that would take years to fully articulate and might not survive its first contact with conditions she hadn't anticipated. The legal piece with Pruitt was real, but the frontier was large, and people's interests changed, and there would be other pressures from other directions in other seasons. The work was permanent. The rest was temporary. She knew that. She had always known that, in the way that people know the truths that cost them something to learn. She looked at her land in the evening light and held all of it, the parts that were good and the parts that were still unfinished and the parts that had hurt and the people who had helped and the years of quiet, stubborn daily work that no story ever fully captured because that work was too ordinary and too enormous at the same time to fit inside a telling. She held it, and then she turned away from the fence and she walked back toward the barn because the evening routine was waiting and the horses needed their water checked. And tomorrow was coming with everything it was going to bring. And she was, as she had always been and intended to always be, exactly where she needed to be.